Okay, so the Sky Island Saga. I've definitely got a lot to say about this one. It is not going to be a short review. I apologize in advance, not necessarily because it's going to be a long review, but I know at multiple points I'll probably go on tangents and start theorizing about One Piece stuff. I mean, how can I not? It's that kind of series that sends you down all sorts of rabbit holes and then you start making connections, even connections that probably aren't even there, at least in my case, but I'll try and refrain from doing that as much as possible. I just know it's going to happen, but is it even my fault? Kind of, but really you should blame One Piece for just being that kind of series. But if I had to summarize my adventure through the Sky Island, I would say overall I definitely enjoyed myself. It's not perfect, and I do have some criticisms, especially about some of the pacing in Skypiea and some of the things that happen, but overall very enjoyable. I have overwhelmingly positive things to say. However, if I had to say the most positive thing I got out of this saga was that it truly made me appreciate One Piece on an even deeper level. Now, I definitely enjoyed One Piece before this point, and I thought it was a great series. I've talked about how it had great world building, and to be fair, I still think Alabasta is the best arc in totality that I've seen. Maybe you disagree with that, but that's not even to diminish these two arcs, because the Jaya arc isn't a particularly long arc, but it's already one of my favorite arcs in the series. All the world building packed into such a short arc like Jaya is just incredible, and I can't wait to talk about it. And then Skypiea, while there were pacing issues that I will talk about, the world building in that was also phenomenal, and I can't wait to dive into it. But now to get into the Jaya arc in particular, I mentioned it's not a particularly long arc. It's only a few episodes long, but it is so jam-packed with just some of the best world building I've seen, not just in One Piece, but really in any anime. When I actually looked back at the amount of names and places and just all sorts of details that it established in this arc, it was mind-boggling how they fit it all in and how they seamlessly did so. So again, high praise for the Jaya arc. It's already one of my favorites. I do think in totality I probably even liked it more than Skypiea. I mean, like, it's kind of a toss-up because, again, I think Skypiea has some extremely high highs, but I also think it has some pretty low lows when it comes to some of the criticisms I have of it. I'll save those for the Skypiea section. Again, I will keep referring to Skypiea because it genuinely feels like Jaya and Skypiea are just part 1 and part 2 of this story, of the Sky Island Saga. So, I mean, it makes sense because they're the two arcs in the Sky Island Saga, if we don't include the filler, that is. So I should warn you, I am going to spend a disproportional amount of time on the Jaya arc, because despite the fact that it's not nearly as long as Skypiea, it's so jam-packed with so many details, so many things to theorize about and talk about and break down. So again, I'm going to spend a lot of time on Jaya, and also partly because with Skypiea, some of the best parts I've also made videos on, so I'm not going to go as in depth as I went in those videos because then this review would be even longer. But again, high praise for the Jaya arc. The very first moment of the Jaya arc, I'm going to spend a while discussing because it might seem like a small thing or like it's kind of important, but the more and more I thought about it, especially as I went throughout this adventure, the more I thought about this Jaya opening, I realized this was such a fundamental moment in Luffy's journey. This is a make or break moment where either he'll make the right decision and do the right thing, or I believe his journey is as good as over if he makes the wrong decision. That's how important I think it is, because what happens? Well, a ship falls from the sky, which is a little weird, but then something even stranger happens, because then their log post points up into the sky, almost like it got fixed on some sort of sky island or something. And to be fair, even while going through this for the first time, I knew that they were going to go up into the sky because, well, I had seen what these arcs were called, and I had seen what the whole saga was called, the Sky Island Saga. I assumed that they were going to go into an island in the sky. Now, that didn't ruin any of this journey for me because seeing the moments was just phenomenal. But anyway, this moment here is interesting because then the natural assumption is, okay, the log post is broken, and Nami says as much, but thankfully you have Robin here. And throughout this entire review, I will probably stress over and over again, because this is something I realized, how important Robin is. Not just to the crew, not just on some like personal level, you know, she's important because she's a crew member, although that is an element of it, but just her actual value, the actual value she provides is immeasurable. It's literally invaluable, because once I got to the end of this entire saga, I genuinely believe not only is she one of the most important people in the entire world, but she's also arguably the second most important on their crew. Again, I guess it might vary depending on what the arc is or what they need in that situation, but simply as far as Luffy finding the One Piece, fulfilling his dream of becoming king of the pirates, outside of himself, I think Robin right now is the one I view as the second most important on the crew to him actually achieving that. But anyway, this is a key moment for Robin because she immediately shows her value. Again, she just joined the crew, and at this point I was definitely thinking like, okay, what do I kind of make of Robin? I didn't think that she was bad. Like, I think she had good motives for joining the crew. I know she said when she basically joined the crew, Luffy saved her, she didn't want to live anymore, so she's kind of his responsibility. I do wonder to a certain extent if it's just because she actually believes in him and she's kind of curious, like she was asking him about what does the D mean in your name back in Alabasta, and the curiosity actually led her to saving him. Once Crocodile impaled Luffy and threw him into the sand, it was Robin who got him out, and the reason she saved him was not because she was like fundamentally a good person. That's not the way I interpret it. She was just genuinely curious about him because her dream is to find the lost history of the world, which becomes exceptionally relevant, especially in this arc, particularly towards the end, and I can't wait to talk about it. But Robin tells them, because Robin has almost a greater understanding of the One Piece world than many of them, she tells them, no, you must never doubt the log pose. That is a hard fact out here. Instead, what you should doubt is the common knowledge or the information in your own head. And this is some of the most important world building I think we've ever gotten, because it's just this idea, but the more and more I thought about it, I realized this made perfect sense as to why no one has been able to find the One Piece. Is because they set out on this journey of finding the One Piece, of becoming king of the pirates. Countless people have. But the thing is, they're over-relying on their own knowledge. They're relying on what everyone knows. But does everyone know how to find the One Piece? No. Only one person in the history of One Piece, as far as I know, ever accomplished what Roger did. So why are you using your common thinking? And even when we get to Jaya, they reveal like, yeah, people don't even trust the log poses. Many people don't because they're constantly getting broken. And I realized so many people have been faced with the same decision Luffy's about to be faced with, where a log pose will probably point to something that seems impossible. Maybe it'll point up into the sky. Maybe it'll point somewhere else. And instead of saying like, oh, maybe I'm wrong about this, like everyone knows that there isn't an island in the sky, but is everyone right? I mean, everyone doesn't know how to find the One Piece. And even when I think back to Gold D. Roger's execution, and the more I learn about Roger, and the further I go along in this story, I'm starting to realize there was probably way more to his initial mission he sent everyone on, of finding the One Piece. And the reason I think that is even when I look back at his actual words, when I even look back at the manga, and that's something else I forgot to mention, which I probably should have mentioned before this point, is for this review, I'm primarily going off of the subbed version of the anime. So character names and stuff like that, I'll be using the subbed version of the anime. But at the same time, I do read parts of the manga. But anyway, when I looked at the manga of what Gold D. Roger said about where you can find his treasure, the wording he uses is very interesting. Because he's saying it's yours if you can find it, but you'll have to search the whole world. And again, whole world, that's in bold, almost like he was stressing, hey, if you find it, it's yours, but you gotta search the whole world. Like, listen to what I'm saying, the whole world. I'm not just saying the parts of the world you think exist. I'm not saying only the surface of the blue sea. No, you'll have to search the whole world. And that's not because I believe the One Piece can be anywhere, technically speaking, but rather because of the Poneglyphs and some stuff that I think is going on, and I'll get more into that later on. But I think that there's clues laid out in just random parts of the world, places that people don't even think exist, And you're not even going to have a chance of even getting to the end of the Grand Line if you don't go to basically everywhere and anywhere. Because I think without those clues, you don't stand a chance. However, I think the decision Luffy has to make is even more important here, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but again, I think it's so fundamentally important, at least to understand what Luffy is kind of doing here, what he's facing here, to also understand why he's probably the man worthy of becoming king of the pirates. And essentially, the more I learn about Gold D. Roger, the more I'm starting to realize it doesn't feel like he just set everyone out on an adventure and it's, if you're lucky enough to find my treasure, it's yours. But rather, it's almost like he sent them out and he knew only someone worthy enough of finding his treasure would be able to find it. It doesn't necessarily matter how strong you are, how rich you are, how lucky you are. If you're not worthy of finding his treasure, you're never going to be able to find it. And even if you do find it somehow, I believe it has no use to you. Like, you have to go through the necessary steps. And so when I really look at the journey Luffy is on, like, sure, he has to get to a tangible place, but even when I think of some of the connections, or at least some of the connections I see between Luffy and Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, who I believe he was kind of inspired by in Chinese mythology, when I look at those connections, they have a lot of similarities, particularly in this arc, which I'll talk about. But Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, he went up to the heavens to fight against the gods, and what's Luffy about to do? He's about to go up into the heavens to fight against someone who calls himself God. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting parallel. But even more so than that, Sun Wukong had to go on a massive adventure, journey to the west. But really what's more important, and here I go theorizing again, I could be way off base, but I wouldn't be shocked if One Piece follows a little bit of this with Luffy, where Sun Wukong at the end of his journey achieved Buddhahood. He achieved enlightenment, he reached nirvana. And I wonder with Luffy on his journey if it's a similar thing, where he kind of has to go through every single step. He's got to go everywhere, he's got to do everything. He's got to really just live this adventure to the fullest. He can't skip any steps, because it's almost this enlightenment he's on, like he'll get some sort of, I almost want to say like spiritual awakening or something like that. I don't know. Obviously, I'm just speculating here. But when I was kind of thinking of those parallels, I was kind of realizing like this quest for the One Piece feels more and more so, at least to me, judging from everything I've seen, like you've got to prove yourself worthy of even finding the One Piece. And if Luffy was to just be dropped off on the final island, I think it's meaningless because he hasn't done the necessary steps. Whatever the One Piece is, it wouldn't matter at that point because he's got to go through every single step. And when I think of Luffy, he wants to go to every island. And even here, he's excited like, oh, Sky Island? Like there might be an island in the sky because Robin is like, yeah, I mean, there probably is an island up there. Like, I haven't heard of Sky Islands. No one has. But Luffy doesn't rely on what everyone knows. And even when I think back to the rules One Piece established here, based on what Robin says, it almost seems like you just have a better chance of making it out here if you ignore common sense, if you ignore what everyone knows. And the more I think about it, who in One Piece, at least as far as I've come across, has less common sense than Luffy? Like, I don't mean that as an insult or anything like that. I'm just being honest. He probably lacks the most common sense. He doesn't have it to begin with. So again, when the log post points up into the sky, he's not someone to rely on common sense and say, well, obviously there's nothing up there. There can't be. Like, let's think about the implications of all this. It just wouldn't work. But Luffy doesn't have that common sense to begin with, so he just hears, there might be a Sky Island. We gotta go up there. He doesn't have the common sense to be worried about stuff, to be fearful about how do you get up there? What if there's nothing up there? Again, I mean this as a compliment, although it might sound like I'm being insulting. I just genuinely believe the less common sense you have, the better chance you have of finding the One Piece, and I believe that's kind of being established here. Maybe you disagree with me, but even if you look at Luffy's entire journey from the start, he's been pushing against common sense the entire time. Common sense would indicate a boy with no real-world experience, with no real-world knowledge, doesn't really know anything about the world, setting out to sea with no navigational knowledge, can't swim, doesn't stand a chance of becoming king of the pirates. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows it's common sense as a pirate to not help someone become a marine. Everyone knows that as a pirate, it doesn't make sense to recruit a pirate hunter at a marine base to your pirate crew. Or how about it's common sense to not recruit a navigator to your crew who hates pirates? Or what about a liar? Like, what possible common sense reason could there be to recruit Usopp to your crew? And even if you look at Usopp's lies, like, clearly they're lies, because it's just common sense that goldfish can't get big enough to have massive crabs that you could walk around on like an island. Like, everyone knows this. But again, does everyone know how to find the One Piece? The less common sense you have in this world, the better chance you have of even becoming king of the pirates. Because again, I genuinely believe Luffy's journey will take him through the necessary steps to achieve some sort of enlightenment, where people will look at him like they looked at the previous king of the pirates and say, yes, that man is different. That man is the least common among us, because what is less common than a king? And so I know I've spent a lot of time basically discussing this, and it might not seem that important, but I really wanted to lay out why I thought this was one of the most important scenes and moments, because I think if Luffy decides, okay, I'm gonna listen to Nami, the log pose is broken, they actually find an eternal pose to Jaya. So at that point, it's just, well, let's just go to Jaya, wait for the log pose to reset. But again, Luffy will even say at a future point in this arc that he knows if he passed up this adventure, he would regret it for the rest of his life. And I think that there's something fundamentally within Luffy that knows he's got to go through the necessary steps. Even when Robin first met the crew way back in the Alabasta Saga, right at the end of Whiskey Peak, and she wanted to help them out, at least that's what it seemed, and she gave them an eternal pose to basically get to Alabasta a lot easier. I don't think it was right to Alabasta, but to a nearby place. And Luffy took that, crushed it, and said, no one tells me what I do. This is my ship. And the more I thought about that, I was like, well, that doesn't seem like common sense at all. It makes for a more entertaining journey, don't get me wrong, because then you got to go to all these different spots, including the next spot where everyone says, oh yeah, like no one returns from there. Little Garden is just a weird place. But to Luffy, well, of course I'm going to go there. That's the next destination on my journey. I'm not going to skip steps, because to him, skipping steps, I think, would basically just ruin the entire journey. Because I genuinely believe if he felt that he skipped any steps, he would feel that he wasn't worthy of becoming king of the pirates. And to be fair, he probably wouldn't be. Because even when I think of the fact that Luffy will decide to go up into the sky, it is kind of interesting to me that Gunfall, and I'll talk more about Gunfall later, he doesn't even mention any other pirates, for example. He only recalls over 20 years ago, Gol Roger coming up here. He doesn't recall like other pirates coming to visit him, maybe to find the golden bell up there with the Poneglyph and stuff. But I do think it's kind of interesting that countless pirates have probably faced a similar choice, that you're faced with something impossible, and in the face of something impossible, you just revert back to what you know, and you don't find a way of making it possible. But again, Luffy is someone who believes he can make the impossible possible, and that's why he's someone worthy of becoming king of the pirates. Because how could you be worthy of this impossible dream if you don't first believe that the impossible is possible? And then once you believe that the impossible is possible, then you find a way of making it possible. But anyway, it doesn't take them long to start looking around this ship. And even a little detail that I don't know if I'm reading too much into, but the ship that fell, now they're looking around, is the St. Brice. And it definitely got me a little curious. Like, Brice is close to the French word bris, which means breakage. It seems pretty fitting. I don't know if they had that in mind, because obviously I know One Piece is written in Japanese. But again, there's also a lot of French influence in this particular arc. You know, you look at places like the Holy Land of Mérijois, which obviously takes inspiration from the Chateau de Chambord in France. You also look at some of the other names, Lafitte, like the pirate Jean Lafitte, and just other things that I'm going to get into. But again, it genuinely feels like every detail has a purpose to be there. Even names of things become very important. And I'll talk about some of the other names when I get to those characters. But they start looking around the ship. Luffy finds a map of Skypiea, and I just love his excitement, because to him, he's like, oh my goodness, this is an adventure I get to go on. Like the log post pointed up, I already was excited to go and see if this Sky Island existed. Here's a map. And to some people, they'd be very skeptical, like, oh, you know, it's a fake. Someone is just playing a joke on you or whatever. Like, there's no islands in the sky. But to Luffy, he fully believes already, and he just thinks that this is confirmation. And this moment with Nami, I always think is kind of interesting, because she's telling Luffy, like, it's impossible, we can't get up there. And he just looks at her and he says, I don't care, figure it out, you're the navigator. Which seems a little unreasonable. Like, I thought my boss had some pretty unreasonable demands, but I might have it easy after this. But the fact is, Luffy is so committed to going on this journey, he knows he'll regret it if he doesn't. And throughout his entire journey, he's wanted to experience this adventure to the fullest. He doesn't even really feel the need to worry about stuff like navigation and things like that. I mean, he has other people to worry about that, but he's like, yeah, I'm here for the adventure. And even I mentioned when he broke the eternal pose, I think he just fundamentally hates the idea of an eternal pose because he likes the randomness of jumping from island to island. He doesn't know what he's going to miss. They went to Little Garden, which is somewhere that they wouldn't have gone if he just used the eternal pose. I don't know all the stuff that's going to pay off, but you have to assume it's important with the giants, and with Usopp in particular, that was an important arc. But then the next place that they went to, which they wouldn't have gone to, was Drum Island, which again, fundamentally important to their journey because they pick up Chopper, they learn some stuff, they even connect with the people there in Dalton, so they have an ally in him. And so Luffy is experiencing this journey to the fullest. But anyway, they start kind of salvaging the ship a little bit more. There is a brief encounter with a couple of monkeys, which I think is kind of funny. Those become more important later on. I'm not really going to mention them other than it's funny how Luffy gets along with this monkey. Like, One Piece is really trying to stress that, okay, his name, Monkey D. Luffy, isn't just a name. Like, every aspect of that has greater meaning to it. And the fact is, the monkey part of it is showing like, yeah, he's a monkey, much like Sun Wukong. At least that's what I believe the connection is. Like, yeah, I'm trying to stress there is a connection there. It's important that he's a monkey. But they find a bunch of stuff like a waiver, which is obviously a foreign technology. So that's kind of interesting. And they even find an eternal pose to Jaya. So at this point, they're like, okay, well, we don't know how to get to the Sky Island. Luffy is saying we have to go, but no one knows how to get there. So we're just going to take this eternal pose to Jaya, try and sort some stuff out before the log pose resets. So again, I like the fact that they're kind of under some time constraint. Like, they have to find out this information because, again, I think it is so fundamentally important for them to go up to the sky. Not simply for the fact that I think that they find a massive hint up there as far as like their journey, the One Piece, the lost history and stuff like that, which I'll talk about, but more so just the spirit of adventure. Like, you gotta go everywhere. You gotta search the whole world. So that means you gotta go to the entire world. And one last thing that I'll briefly note, because it has a great payoff in the future, is the fact that they're just in the open sea and all of a sudden it turns dark and they just see these massive giant shadows. And the payoff for that and the way that they do it is just perfect. I just wanted to make note of that. They're on their way to Jaya. And briefly, we do see Buggy, who's in the area, which was kind of a reminder. I had, in all honesty, kind of forgotten about Buggy. Now, I know Buggy is a fan favorite character, so I assumed he would pop up at multiple points in the story going forward, but it was a reminder like, oh yeah, Buggy is out here. And Ace randomly shows up on the ship, which is kind of funny. You know, he falls asleep. But the importance of that is that Buggy gives us some more world building here, because his crew is like, okay, we got to turn him in. And he's like, no, here's the rules of this world. You never harm a Whitebeard pirate. And he starts giving some information like Whitebeard is the strongest man in the world without a doubt. He is the man closest to finding the One Piece, and he never forgives those who hurt members of his crew. He also says he fought neck and neck with Roger. So at this point, I'm kind of like, okay, this guy seems like the real deal. And we do get more of an introduction later, which I can't wait to talk about. And something I wanted to note quickly is that it is kind of surprising that Buggy knows all of this. Even his own crew is like, wait, how do you know all of this? But the more I'm starting to learn about Buggy, the more I'm kind of realizing like he may be more important than I realized, especially because he seems to be so closely tied to so many incredibly powerful people like Whitebeard, not to mention Shanks, and some of the revelations about Shanks that are about to come up I can't wait to talk about. So I just wanted to add that to basically say like, yeah, I'm definitely keeping my eye on Buggy a little bit more now. I do take issue with one of the things he said, and I'm probably saying something blasphemous or just wrong. I fully accept that, like I'm probably about to say something kind of idiotic. But I took a little issue when he said he's the man closest to the One Piece. because I don't really believe that. Like, I believe Luffy is the man closest to the One Piece, because I truly believe that you have to be worthy of even claiming this great treasure. It's not something you can get simply on strength, but you have to go through all the necessary steps. You almost have to be enlightened. And they keep making a ton of parallels, like Luffy has a lot of similarities to Gold D. Roger. Aside from the name, just the fact that he almost follows his footsteps where he goes, also the way he kind of acts, and the lack of common sense he often uses. It just seems like they kind of made it a point that Roger and Whitebeard, very similar levels of strength, but one guy was exalted above the other because he was just different. And again, I kind of look at it and say, I view Luffy the same. Like, it doesn't matter how strong Whitebeard is. If he hasn't found the One Piece at this point, there has to be a good reason. And I assume it's kind of related to the fact that he's just not worthy of even finding the One Piece. But again, like, I could be saying something totally ignorant. I understand that. I just don't know. This could be a hard, cold fact. He's the man closest to the One Piece. But I also don't believe that anyone aside from really Luffy has the possibility of even getting the One Piece, because I think he's the only one who will be worthy of it. But moving on, the crew quickly arrives in Jaya, and more particularly Mock Town, which is kind of a crazy town. It's literally a town filled with pirates, but the worst part about this town is not that it's filled with pirates, or that these pirates aren't nice people. The worst part is that it's one of the sorriest places in all of the One Piece world, if you ask me, because it's just filled with people with no dreams. And worse than even that, they're not just dreamless, but they crush other people's dreams, or they try their best to. So you could imagine someone like Luffy strolling into town. It may not go well because he's someone with the grandest dreams of them all. But one of the interesting things about this town is you quickly learn how much value they place on bounties, and they almost power scale each other with bounties. Not quite. There's this insufferable pirate there, Bellamy the hyena, who has a 55 million berry bounty, which apparently is the highest here, or at least the highest that they know of. But I do think it's kind of funny that the two pirate crews on this island that nobody really cares about, or people just look past as worthless, are also probably the two strongest pirate crews. And I'm talking about Luffy's pirate crew and Blackbeard's pirate crew. And I'm not even talking about bounties with them, because that doesn't even matter. Although it is kind of a funny detail, and you knew from the moment you saw it that they were setting up kind of an interesting twist, that Luffy just thinks he only has a 30 million berry bounty and none of the other crew have bounties at all. Luffy, of course, got a 100 million berry bounty, and Zoro's a 60 million, but that hasn't been widely announced to the world yet. But Luffy, Nami, and Zoro are walking around this town. They're looking for information on the Sky Island. But I do want to make note of this one encounter that they have with this weird guy that falls off a horse. Now, obviously I know now that he's a Blackbeard pirate, but even this moment always kind of stood out to me as a little odd, because Zoro and Luffy help him up and he gives them an apple. And it's a test, so he's kind of a sick dude, don't get me wrong. A lot of these apples will explode, and one guy isn't so lucky you see a massive explosion go off. But Luffy is lucky, he just gets a normal apple, and the way this guy just kind of ominously looks at Luffy and kind of laughs and says, "You're lucky." Not even that, but there's this element of destiny that's going to be stressed over and over and over again, like you just have good destiny on your side. And so the reason I wanted to briefly talk about that moment is because I think it has a great payoff a little later on. But anyway, they're walking around. They do have a brief encounter with some of the Bellamy pirates. They aren't nice to them, and immediately you know that they're going to cause some trouble. But Luffy, Nami, and Zoro, they go into this bar, and this is where we're first introduced to Blackbeard. And you don't know it's Blackbeard at this point. I did have my suspicions, not because he has like a massive black beard or anything like that. In fact, he doesn't. But what was interesting about this is just how opposite he was to Luffy. One guy says he likes the pies, the other says he hates it. One guy says he likes the drink, the other hates it. And they're reversed each time, so it's not like one guy just likes everything and one guy hates everything. But just seeing how they start bickering with each other and competing immediately, like, you know, okay, they're setting that up for something, which they even have more set up later, which I can't wait to talk about. Now, something I wanted to make note of, if I'm right about Blackbeard and he's basically going to become one of the major antagonists to Luffy or something like that, they really do feel like they're setting him up if I'm right, this is kind of a funny way to introduce a character like that. Because again, this is kind of a funny scene. Usually you would think you would introduce a series antagonist with some crazy fight scene or something like that. Not Luffy and him are competing over food and drink and different things like that. I mean, this is kind of wild, but I love it. But even though his name hasn't been revealed as Blackbeard, I'm just going to call him Blackbeard for the rest of this arc to basically simplify things. He walks out, but you could tell he was definitely interested in Luffy, and he does something which is very subtle. Because he walks out and he sees Bellamy go by him and he kind of knows like, okay, something is going to happen, and he turns around and you can tell he waits because he's curious about Luffy. Like he got kind of a sense from him, but he's going to see how he interacts here. And this moment here, you just knew it wasn't going to end well. It was worse than I thought, not because it wasn't a good moment, it was. But Bellamy walks in, he immediately confronts Luffy, he pretends to be his friend, offers him a drink and smashes his head through the bar. He's instigating a fight, and so Luffy gets up and his initial instinct is he's going to fight Bellamy, but then he listens to Bellamy start to talk, and Bellamy says this isn't a fight, it's a test. But regardless, I think this moment really just reminded Luffy of Shanks and what Shanks did. But then Nami makes it worse because she asks the bartender quite loudly, like, we don't want any of this. We're just looking for the Sky Island. Do you know anything about the Sky Island? Which freaks out everyone in the bar at first, and then they start laughing and mocking them, and you realize, like, okay, it's called Mocktown because they mock other people's dreams. And Bellamy just starts lacing into them about how stupid and foolish pirates are who have dreams. Dreams of the One Piece, the City of Gold, the City of Emeralds, which the City of Emeralds part is still fascinating to me. Like, okay, what is that? Because the City of Gold and the One Piece, those are both things that I've heard of. But Bellamy is telling them all these things have natural explanations, like log poses getting broken lead people to their deaths because they think that the log pose is telling them to go to somewhere that really is just to their death. And he's giving them information like no one trusts log poses anymore. And he's laughing at them and he's mocking them and he's telling them the era where pirates dream about things is over, which the payoff for that is perfect. But Luffy is just listening to Bellamy, and I guess in that moment he was also thinking of Shanks, but he's listening to this pathetic husk of a human being who has no dreams of his own. He's just broken inside. And you see Luffy's fist and it starts to unclench. And he's realized, yeah, some things just aren't worth fighting over. I would gain nothing from fighting this guy. He is just a pathetic pirate. You could tell Luffy just feels sorry for him in that moment. And Bellamy hits him, but interestingly, Luffy's not fighting back at all. He just looks at ZORO and he says, ZORO, no matter what, don't fight. And what I love so much about this moment is ZORO fully trusts his captain and he listens to him. And ZORO and Luffy don't fight, they just take it all. They get quite a bad beating, and worse than even the beating, it's just everyone mocking them as just these losers with these wild, stupid dreams. But eventually they stop. But even though I know that they did the right thing, it still was hard to watch because you know how easily they could deal with every single one of the people in there. But it sets up a perfect moment because Nami is dragging ZORO and Luffy out and she's kind of upset. I think kind of rightfully so, or not rightfully so, but I understand the reason she's upset. And she just hears a voice from the distance say, the Sky Island exists. And you turn and you look and you just see Blackbeard sitting in the middle of the walkway, almost like he was waiting for them, because this isn't somewhere you just sit normally, at least not that I would assume. And again, he heard everything. I interpreted it like, okay, he wanted to see how Luffy would handle it because he was kind of curious. But he doesn't say anything more about the Sky Islands, and they don't even care to ask him more, and I'll talk more about why I think that is. But he doesn't say anything about, like, if he's been to the Sky Islands. I don't think he has. I simply believe that because he's much like Luffy, although basically opposites, at the core, he's a dreamer like Luffy, so why wouldn't he believe in cities of gold, the One Piece, you know, just the Sky Islands? So that right there is kind of a detail that I don't think he's been there, but he just so inherently believes in it. I could be wrong, maybe he has been there, but he believes in the Sky Islands. He goes on though, and he's talking about this era of theirs that they're talking about is crap. And then he says, still one of my favorite lines, people's dreams have no end. And I just get chills every time I see that scene or even think about it because it just seems so perfect. And even when I think of the author of this series, Oda, and I start to think about like his journey, such as dropping out of school, going up against the advice of a lot of people, really, he probably faced so much criticism, so many people mocking him for having dreams. So in many ways, I feel like he writes this story as a way of saying like, yeah, people are gonna mock you for dreams, but guess what? If you're willing to go after them, there's a chance you might fail. But at the same time, you won't ever know. Oda was someone who got to make his dream a reality and probably even surpassed what he thought he could do. So I think in many ways he inserts that into his stories, and there's almost a romanticism to it, which also becomes a big theme of this entire saga. Not to mention this entire story of One Piece. The very beginning was called Romance Dawn. So I think in many ways Oda loves this idea of romanticism because he feels like in many ways his life has probably followed that, like he went after his dream and it worked out. But it is kind of interesting the way that they show this scene is that you only see Blackbeard and then Luffy, Nami, and Zoro. Despite the fact that then they show that there are people all around who are like, what is this guy talking about? But the way that they kind of transition to that is almost a way of showing that in that moment, Blackbeard doesn't care about what other people think. He doesn't care about people who mock others' dreams. He was only fixed on Luffy and the people Luffy was with. And I think in many ways the most interesting part about this is Luffy's response, because he doesn't say anything. And I could interpret this so many ways, and sometimes I go back and forth. Like, this is a scene I think about from time to time. It just nags at the back of my brain. Like, what is Luffy thinking in this situation? And to an extent, I definitely think he agreed with Blackbeard, but he could also sense that there was maybe something a little off with him. Because Luffy, as much as he's not the most intelligent person, when it comes to knowing people's characters or emotional intelligence, he's incredibly bright. He knows people's characters. And I think he could sense there's something a little off with this guy. He seems kind of dangerous. In many ways, like I think Blackbeard could kind of sense like there's something a little curious about Luffy. He didn't know what, but just seeing how Luffy wouldn't break eye contact with him, even when Zoro and Nami walked away, Luffy kept looking at him, almost to see like, okay, who would blink first? And so Blackbeard walks away, but it's only after Blackbeard turns his back that Luffy decides to start walking away. And Nami even is like, hey, did you want to ask more about the Sky Islands? And they're like, no. Almost like they knew, like, okay, we probably shouldn't interact with this guy. Like, somewhere in Luffy and Zoro's mind, they could kind of tell, like, yeah, there's probably a little something off with him. But even though I'm probably going to regret this, that whole scene in that moment kind of made me like Blackbeard. But I know he's being set up as a series antagonist, and if that wasn't enough, the fact that they were so opposites, even when you see Luffy and Blackbeard walking away from each other, the split screen is almost like, yeah, these two are inherently tied to each other. It was like they were showing their opposite sides of the same coin. Like maybe at the core, they both are dreamers, but then opposite sides, they go about it in vastly different ways. But everyone goes back to the ship. None of them have any leads of how to get to Sky Island, but thankfully, Robin is on the crew, and again, I keep stressing how important Robin is. She was out there getting some stuff done. She has a map of Jaya, or I should say, what's left of Jaya, because that becomes important. But she also heard about this guy who was cast out, Mont Blanc Cricket, because he was a dreamer, and she shows them the location. He may have an idea. So they go to Cricket's place. He's not there, but they do find this interesting children's book, Noland the Liar. But Sanji's the only one that knows about it because apparently he's from the North Blue, which is some new information, and everyone in the North Blue knows the tale about Noland the Liar, who told a ton of lies, but especially he lied to his king about a city of gold, and it led to his execution. But Cricket does arrive and he starts attacking them immediately. However, he quickly collapses because they realize he has the bends, or he has decompression sickness. He's not decompressing correctly because he's diving way down, looking for the city of gold. So he's literally killing himself in this battle he has. He's killing himself for this dream he has. And I kind of think that that's a little romantic to a certain extent, which also, as I said, is a theme of the entire series, really, but especially of these couple of arcs. But there is something kind of sad about it. But Cricket does wake up, And they start asking Cricket like, hey, do you know anything about a Sky Island? And he immediately laughs at them, but I don't think he was laughing because it was like, oh, it's a stupid idea or anything like that. Instead, he was laughing because he was just so shocked he came across a bunch of dreamers like himself. A bunch of crazy people, as he calls them. But he starts telling them, well, he doesn't know if it exists, but he did hear of one guy who thought it existed. He's talking about Noland the Liar, which isn't necessarily a great reference. Like, this guy is a famous liar. But I think the most interesting part is the way Luffy and his crew handles this information. But before they even handle this information, quickly they ascertain that, okay, this guy Cricket here, he's a distant descendant of Noland, and in fact, his entire life has basically been changed forever because of his affiliation with Noland. And Cricket tells them about how his entire Mont Blanc family has been outcast this entire time. People still mock him and the entire family to this day about Noland the Liar, this famous liar. But then he says something interesting because he says, but no one in the family holds any sort of ill will towards Noland, and he reveals it's because everyone knew him as an exceptionally honest man, which is so vastly different from the way he's been depicted. But I also wanted to make note that it seems like a theme of this saga in particular is lost history or even wrong history. When you look at, well, Noland, for example, everything people know of Noland today is just wrong, and learning his backstory is very depressing. But even stuff about the Shandians, people don't even know about them, or the lost history of the Void Century, it kind of becomes a theme like, okay, discovering what actually happened. But then even hearing Cricket's backstory was a little depressing because he's talking about, for him, he just wanted to run away from that past. He didn't want to be associated with Noland, so he became a pirate, not because he wanted to, but because he was running away. But then 10 years ago, by accident, he came to this island of Jaya. And he knew there's no more running. So for the last 10 years, he's been here. And he says for him, it's not about even proving Noland's innocence. He's just in a duel with the man that forever changed his life. And like I said, there is something kind of depressing about that, but there is also something kind of romantic about it. And honestly, I loved Cricket's backstory. It was deeply impactful because I think it captures a feeling almost everyone can resonate with. Everyone can kind of relate to a certain extent, and that is trying to run away from your problems. But I think everyone kind of knows subconsciously that you can only run away from your problems for so long, and this story, this backstory here captures it. And it reminded me of that quote, a person often meets his destiny on the road he took to avoid it. Because if you think of Cricket's entire life, he had this cloud hanging over his family, and he just tried to get away from it. He didn't even want to become a pirate, but he became a pirate because he said, I just need to get as far away from this as possible. I want to avoid my past. I want to avoid those problems. So he set out to sea, and of course he comes across the very island his ancestor also came across, the island that made him infamous for being a liar. So in that moment, I just love how he probably was like, I just can't outrun this. I tried to, but it brought me all the more closer to this. So I might as well face it, even if it cost me my life. And the fact that Cricket was like, okay, even if it kills me, I'm going to find out the truth. This is my dream. I just need to know, did Noland lie? I don't even need to know that he told the truth. I just need to find out the answer. And a big part of the reason I like that so much is that is the same determination we find in our crew members. Basically, every single one of them is willing to die for their dream, and some of them probably will. But yes, his Cricket backstory was certainly impactful, and the thing is, after Skypiea, after learning about Noland, after learning about Calgara and what happened to everything, it made this moment all the more impactful. But again, it has a certain romanticism to it, the fact that this man is willing to die just to know the truth. Of course though, instead of looking down, he probably should have been looking to the heavens, but I guess he should be thankful that Luffy came along. But Cricket does show them Noland's logbook, and he's probably expecting like, oh, they're not going to believe him because he's a famous liar, like why would you believe what Noland said? And Noland hasn't even been to the Sky Island. In the logbook, he's just talking about travelers who he met who claimed to have gone to Sky Islands, and he found like a waver and skyfish, and it is just such a heartwarming moment to see how excited the Straw Hats are getting the more that they're reading about Sky Island. Especially because you see Cricket walking away and he's smiling. Probably smiling for the first time in a long time, because not only did he meet this bunch of crazy dreamers, kind of like himself, but they actually believe Noland's words and are actually excited to go to this place no one even knows of. And so Cricket tells the monkey friends he has that they've got to do everything they can to try and get them to Sky Island. Which is interesting because they don't even know that it exists, but at the same time, they're a bunch of dreamers, so how could they not believe in something like Sky Island? Now, I do love this moment where Cricket, he's trying to explain to them, like, okay, this is how we're going to try and get you up there, and the more and more he goes on, the less likely it seems that this is even going to work, because even if you can ride your way up to the sky, which is a big if, you don't know if there's anything up there for sure. And even if there is something up there, like, are we sure we're going to the right place? Are we sure anything is going to stop us from falling right back down? Again, it's funnier and funnier how even some of the crew members who were excited are starting to have second thoughts or third thoughts, or, you know, just like, Luffy, you sure you want to do this? And Luffy is just kind of, you know, he's Luffy, so he's even more excited. He's even lost it just imagining like, man, this adventure is going to feel so great, which is why I love Luffy. I will say, I really do like how detailed of an explanation Cricket goes into as to how this world actually works with the natural phenomena, and essentially he has a very detailed explanation of how this knock-up stream that they're going to ride up even works to begin with. And the reason I like this is because it shows a certain level of attention to detail that you really don't see in a lot of stories. Like, they kind of hand wave it away. Like, oh, you know, there's just a giant whirlpool that sends you up. But no, One Piece is like, yeah, I'm going to show you, or I'm going to explain to you why this actually works. Now, they use their own rules, but it even reminds me of when Cricket was telling them Noland's story, and he was saying, even till the end, Noland swore that he saw the City of Gold, but he assumed it sunk into the ocean. Now, of course, with Skypiea, he was a little wrong, but he talks about how he thought that there were crustal movements and it essentially swallowed up this massive island. However, I think that that has more repercussions when you really just think of the One Piece world, because it tells you another key detail. So like our world, there are crustal movements. You do have basically tectonic plates shifting constantly, which changes locations of different places, whether it's maybe treasure maps, especially if they're really old treasure maps, are a little different. I also do wonder the implications on the final island. Like, maybe it's constantly moving around because it's on like a very loose tectonic plate or something like that. I don't know. But regardless, it's all kind of fascinating how much attention to detail was placed into the world building. So I just wanted to highlight that quickly. But Cricket explains to them, this is what you're going to do. You really only have one shot before the log post resets tomorrow, so they're on that kind of time constraint. And I love the fact that Cricket essentially says, like, man, I'm just so happy I met this bunch of crazy dreamers, and they party all night long. But Cricket says something interesting where he talks about the last words Noland wrote, when he says Noland wrote, "I saw gold in the skull's right eye," which doesn't really make any sense right now, but it will make a ton of sense very fast. I just love these mysteries with clues that seem to make really no sense and then have a perfect payoff, which I feel like this payoff is incredible. But he tells them about how when Noland landed at this place where he found the City of Gold, he heard the sound of south birds, and he also heard the sound of a magnificent gold bell. And that gold bell, I had no idea how important that would become. But I'll definitely talk about that because, again, I went from really not caring much about this gold bell to understanding how much significance it had. Now all of a sudden Cricket remembers that they'll need some help getting where they need to in the open sea, so he sends them out into the jungle in the middle of the night to go and get a south bird. It's just a bird, like the name says. It only points south. I think it's kind of a funny little creation by One Piece. So they head into the jungle, and just the jungle moments are hilarious, but even to talk about the south birds, the implications with that, I guess I hadn't even thought of before, but even with the final island, for example, you have to imagine they're probably going to run into other creatures that have some sort of connection with key places in One Piece, like they point to key places or they migrate to key places. Like, who's to say that there aren't a group of birds that migrate to the final island? I don't think that's how you're gonna find it, but I'm saying like maybe there's little clues like that. But yeah, the whole jungle scene was hilarious. So much happened in there. And then the fact that the South Bird was essentially playing around with them. Again, a lot of funny scenes. I could talk about them more, but I got plenty of other stuff I still need to get to. But then we see Cricket and his two monkey friends. They face Bellamy and his crew, and Bellamy is pretty strong. I mean, he's not Luffy and Zoro level strong, or even Sanji. I'll throw in Sanji just so I don't start a war or anything like that. But also because Sanji is right up there as well. It was tough to watch Bellamy beat up Cricket and his two monkey friends, and then steal all the gold. This is gold that he spent 10 years of his life and he was killing himself for because he was diving into the ocean. Now I will say there is something kind of funny about this, is that before Bellamy left, he just couldn't help himself. But they had to put the Bellamy pirate symbol on Cricket's house. So when the Straw Hats return, they don't know what happened, they just see the gold is gone, Cricket and his two monkey friends are beat up, and Cricket is refusing to tell them, which I do like the fact that he's like, oh, don't worry about me. It's fine, you don't have to worry about any of this. But Zoro sees Bellamy's mark, and I love how he just calls Luffy's name. But this is one of those moments where I love how Luffy and Zoro kind of share this connection, where oftentimes they're on the same wavelength with each other, like just a look, and they both know what the other wants the other to do. And just seeing how serious Luffy got, and Zoro just asks like, hey, want help? He knows what Luffy is going to do. He's not trying to stop him or anything like that. He just asks like, hey, do you want help? He doesn't say, do you need help? Because he knows Luffy can handle this. Again, just that understanding Zoro and Luffy have, I love it. But anyway, Luffy says, I gotta go and do something. I'll be back before it's time to leave. And he runs to Mocktown to go and confront Bellamy. But it is kind of funny how Bellamy would have been perfectly fine if he would have just left things as is. He probably would have even had a much higher opinion of himself. But what's about to happen is all his doing, literally. And so something else that they set up where no one really knew Luffy and Zoro's bounties, let alone how strong they actually were. The bounties finally arrive in Mocktown, and the payoff is hilarious because, again, one of the guys, he freaks out. He tells everyone in the bar, like, oh my goodness, Bellamy, you gotta run. And he's not wrong. Like, this guy fully believes in the value of bounties, and it is kind of funny that they place so much value on bounties until the moment it doesn't work in Bellamy's favor anymore, because Bellamy is like, no, I know these kind of pirates. These are the kind of pirates that fake bounties so that they could build up a reputation without actually doing any of the work. He's definitely wrong, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. Luffy's bounty doesn't feel nearly high enough. And the thing is, it probably isn't, even at this point. Like, his bounty should be constantly changing, and even when you think of the threat level, I don't think that there's a single person in the One Piece world with a more serious threat level than Luffy. Not even because he's the main protagonist, I'm talking about right now. Because if you just somewhat follow his journey, his growth has been so exponential, you gotta be monitoring this guy. But Bellamy settles everyone down because, again, when something is hard to believe, he'll just try and throw whatever explanation he needs on it. But then you just hear a voice come from outside yelling Bellamy's name. And obviously, everyone goes outside, and Bellamy is looking at Luffy, which is something I always kind of appreciate about One Piece, is when you look at Luffy, he doesn't really seem like the strongest guy, especially in comparison to a lot of the strongest people in One Piece, because it almost seems to be a thing, not all the time, but almost seems to be a common element that how strong you are is directly correlated to how big you are at the same time. It's not always the case and it's not perfect, but to a certain extent, if you're a bigger guy, if you're stronger, you're probably also more powerful. Even when you look at someone like Whitebeard, who I'm going to talk about when he's introduced, he's obviously a very big guy. Luffy, on the other hand, he doesn't necessarily inspire fear simply by looking at him. But Bellamy is even like, hey, I heard the rumors about you. And Luffy has no idea what he's talking about, but he doesn't care. He said, I gave you a chance. You messed up. You went too far this time. I just need you to give the gold back, And I love the exchange because Bellamy's like, well, I stole it. I'm a pirate. You should be fine with that. Pirate steal. And he's like, well, yeah, I'm going to steal it back now. And I love that even in this moment, Luffy was still giving him a way out. But Bellamy refused to take it. And he was using his devil fruit to spring all about. Luffy was standing there taking all of the mocking, all of the taunts about how stupid dreamers were. And then when Bellamy goes in for the kill, Luffy just lands. Still one of my favorite punches I've seen in anime. Like, it is up there with one of the most satisfying punches, because not only is the punch animated well, with just the sound design and everything, but the meaning behind it is also perfect. Like, Luffy isn't playing around. They've also built up so much hate towards this Bellamy guy. Like, he is one of the most hateable villains, in my opinion. Not because he's doing the worst stuff or he's the most dangerous, but he's someone everyone can relate to. Someone who just craps all over people's dreams, and yet is so afraid to dream for themselves. And I'll be honest, I didn't really expect this fight to be nearly as easy as it was for Luffy. I'm glad it was, and I think it's actually more fitting. But at the same time, while Luffy was running to go and fight him, I was like, well, he does have a 55 million berry bounty, so Bellamy isn't exactly weak. But when Luffy just ended this guy with one shot, it was so perfect, because in that moment, it showed everyone they're not even close. Everyone was just looking on like, oh, this guy could have ended us all earlier if he really wanted to. He just showed restraint. And if Luffy would have gotten into like a tough fight with him, it wouldn't have had nearly the same impact. So I really like that it was this easy for Luffy. And after my initial hype had worn off, I just couldn't stop laughing at this scene because everyone watching just had a collective moment. Maybe we made a mistake. I thought that was probably one of the funnier moments of this arc, and it wasn't even meant to be a funny moment. And Luffy just asks, where's the gold? They tell him, and as he's walking away, I love this moment, because one of Bellamy's crewmen, I guess it's probably his first mate, he just can't accept it, and he's yelling at Luffy like, where are you going? And Luffy turns around suddenly, and he's shocked, and he's like, where? The sky. And the reason I like this moment so much is because Luffy is just confidently stating something that's kind of crazy. He's going up into the sky, but again, he's being perfectly honest. His crew was trying to figure out how to go into the sky earlier. Just because they were laughed at and mocked and beat up for being dreamers doesn't mean that he would let someone like them crush his dreams. I mean, Luffy has bigger dreams than going into the sky. That's nothing compared to becoming king of the pirates. So why would he let just some insignificant pirates who have no dreams of their own crush his dreams? Like, Luffy's probably been told how stupid he is all the time for having dreams, for trying to become king of the pirates. Heck, I've seen it over and over and over again. But you think he would let that faze him? So why would he let someone like Bellamy and his crew stop him from trying to go into the sky? Or why would he let just common sense that tells you, well, there's no way that there can be a Sky Island? Why would he let common sense stand in his way of going into the sky? So I love this moment for a few reasons. So the JAYA arc has had a lot of great moments up to this point, but the craziest part is my favorite moment is just about to come up, because all of a sudden we see Dracula Mihawk, and my favorite moment isn't necessarily this, but it's the start of this moment where we just get a massive amount of world building, just a world building dump, because all of a sudden you see Mihawk, he's sailing towards something, you don't know what yet. I definitely wasn't expecting what he was sailing for, but he has Luffy and Zoro's new bounty posters, and just seeing how excited he's getting, like, okay, this could get kind of interesting. But then we actually go to this place, it's called the Holy Land of Mary Joie, and instantly you can just look at it and tell it was clearly inspired by the real world French palace, the Chateau de Chambord. And it makes me realize even more so just how much real world inspiration One Piece takes, well, from the real world. All throughout the story there's been character names or places that clearly have been inspired by the real world, and part of me really enjoys that, especially because depending on what part of the world you're reading or watching One Piece from, you're probably going to pick up on stuff that the vast majority of people aren't. Like in the last arc in Alabasta, for example, when they were going through the desert and they have the Bar pirates with their captain Barbarossa. I mean, clearly that's a real world inspiration to the Barbary pirates, and their real-world captain, Barbarossa. I mean, they were a famous group of Ottoman pirates, so I kind of like the inspiration. So that was kind of interesting, but the moment gets even more fascinating because there's a Marine. And side note, I really love the design of the Marine coats, how they have justice on the back and just the entire look. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but I do kind of wish we got to see a little bit more of the Marines' perspective in this story. Yes, I know it's a pirate story, and the Marines aren't exactly like the good guys. I don't think that they're exactly the bad guys either. It's just depending on who you are as an individual. But this Marine is very worried about something, and he's talking to people who we're introduced to, and this is fascinating because they're called the 5 Elder Stars. And apparently they're the highest authority in the world government, so again, more world building. And even looking at them, I'm like, okay, some of them seem to look very familiar. Like one of the guys appears to look kind of like Gandhi. Another one appears to be Gorbachev. I mean, he's got the same marking on his head, so I don't know who the others might have been inspired by, but I am assuming that they at least have real world inspirations. If a couple of them do, they all probably do. But regardless, what they're being told is still one of the most fascinating things I think I've ever heard, where I was definitely racking my brain because they're talking about this pirate, Redhair, and how they're very concerned that he might be meeting up with Whitebeard. And even though it's not explicitly stated in this meeting that it's Shanks that they're talking about, it becomes pretty clear in the next few scenes that yeah, it's 100% Shanks that they're talking about. But that makes me wonder because they're almost talking about them like these are 2 major world power players. Like Whitebeard, I understand. He's literally been described as the world's strongest man. Shanks, on the other hand, like I knew he was strong, especially because he's quite mysterious, not to mention his role in Luffy's life. Like they probably wouldn't have made Luffy's inspiration or his like mentor, so to speak, someone who was weak. But I can remember how shocked I was when Mihawk and Shanks were meeting up like they were basically on equal terms. And now it seems like Whitebeard and Shanks might be meeting up and they're almost talked about on equal terms. Again, it just made me realize like, who the heck is Shanks? This guy seems to be a major power player. In a way I didn't even assume before. I remember my first assumption about Shanks, especially after the Mihawk meeting, was that he was a warlord of the sea, but I kind of ruled that out, and this was the definitive no, he's not. But it's fascinating that this whole meeting is because they're concerned about keeping the balance of the 3 world powers. Now I know what 2 of the powers are because they say it. It's the Navy and it's the 7 warlords. I don't exactly know what that other world power is, but I'm assuming because Shanks and Whitebeard are associated with that world power. Maybe that other power is just all the world pirates. Maybe it's a more exclusive group of pirates that aren't under the Navy's thumb. But the fact that they are so worried as the leaders of the world about Shanks and Whitebeard possibly meeting up, that's kind of crazy. Again, the amount of world building and just information that's dumped in this meeting, but really this whole arc is just incredible. But if that moment wasn't good enough, I love this other moment where again, they're very concerned about keeping the balance between the world powers, and the fact that they only have 6 warlords because of the crocodile incident. It is kind of funny that Luffy is already destabilizing the world, and he's just getting started. So you can only imagine that that whole balance between the power systems that they're talking about, Luffy's just going to shatter that. That's what I'm assuming at least. Because if he's already ruined the balance this early on in his journey, I can only imagine what he's going to do to it once he keeps going. And these Elder Stars have appeared to take notice of Luffy, which I kind of like, but is also a little concerning because they literally say that we cannot let the man who defeated Crocodile remain unchecked. Who is this? Monkey D. Luffy. So I don't really think that that bodes too well for Luffy, but it's also kind of, it's very high praise, the fact that the world leaders are taking note of Luffy. Now something else that's interesting is Mihawk was actually heading towards a meeting between the Warlords and the Navy, and we see 2 other Warlords arrive. We see one of them is Bartholomew Kuma, who has a massive bounty, or I should say former bounty because they're Warlords so they don't have bounties anymore. But 296 million is staggeringly high. And then the other warlord is Don Quixote do Flamingo, who I've heard vague mentions of before, but I gotta say, I love his character design. He looks very much like a rock star, like an Elton John or something like that. Not to mention, just the name. So the Doflamingo part, that makes sense because he's got like a massive flamingo feather coat on. But the Don Quixote part is interesting because of the famous novel Don Quixote. I used to love reading that novel, which is all the crazy adventures. I don't know if Don Quixote has a lot to do with this warlord, as far as like, does he have a lot of similarities? I don't know. I'll kind of watch for that. But even his former bounty is incredibly high, 340 million. And I haven't even seen Mihawk's bounty or some of the other warlords. So it's really starting to make me realize that Crocodile might have been the weakest of the warlords. I mean, it makes sense because Luffy fought him the earliest on. But the difference between Crocodile and even Mihawk's level seems so astronomically high. And even this meeting between the warlords and the Navy is just fascinating because, again, these two groups don't really like each other. Now, of course, the warlords work for the Navy or work with the Navy, I guess. But you see even Doflamingo is messing around with some of the Marines. So, again, like, he feels, I guess, rather untouchable in this situation. He's just messing with them. But then you see the head of the Marines walk in, the Fleet Admiral. And his name is fascinating to me because it's Saint Sengoku. Now, the Saint part is interesting, but the Sengoku part is even more fascinating to me. Now, I definitely could be reading way too much into this, but it's interesting that the head of the Marines was given the name Sengoku. Like, that feels deliberate, right? Because the Sengoku period was not a peaceful period. Very much the opposite. There was just constant wars and fighting. Like, is that a sign of things to come? I'm gonna assume so because, again, I assume One Piece will only get crazier and crazier the further it goes along. But the fact that he gave the head of the Marines kind of like a red flag name, like Sengoku, I don't think it bodes too well for the Marines. Now, it would have been kind of cool to see all 6 of the remaining warlords. Unfortunately, only 2 arrived, and then Mihawk walks in and he basically says, like, I'm just here because I'm interested in the parties being discussed. And obviously he's talking about Luffy and ZORO. But if this meeting wasn't weird enough, then all of a sudden a stranger shows up or makes his presence known, which on the one hand, how did he sneak up here? Isn't this like their holy land? I mean, the seat of government power? That's kind of impressive. Or on the other hand, it means that they don't have great security. I'm going to go with it's probably more impressive. But he introduces himself, or rather someone introduces him as Lafitte, which, again, I think that's taking inspiration from Jean Lafitte, the real-world French pirate. But regardless, he's here to recommend someone for the 7th Warlord role. And he says this person's name is Teach. And it was at that moment I knew he was talking about Blackbeard, because I know Edward Teach was the real name for Blackbeard in our world. And Lafitte even clarifies that his name is Blackbeard and he's working on something big, which again, I don't think bodes that well. But the Marines seem to be open to this idea. He just needs to prove himself in some way, which you have an idea of how he was hoping to do it. Now it makes me wonder, what is he going to do? But we follow up that moment with another great one, because then we're finally introduced to Whitebeard, and he's getting delivered a message by one of Shanks' crewmates. And I do think it's kind of interesting the way they almost power scale this to a certain extent, because the messenger says he's a newcomer to Shanks' crew, he's got a bounty of 94 million berries, which again, like, isn't quite power scaling, but I'm trying to kind of assume, like, okay, what must Shanks's be? Because if this guy's a newcomer, then I assume he's one of the weaker ones, maybe even the weakest guy in the crew, but, you know, it's hard to say. So Shanks's bounty must be so astronomically high. But Whitebeard just rips up the letter, and you see Whitebeard, and this guy is massive. Now, he's also in rough shape, and he seems to be quite old, but he's literally hooked up to, like, machines and stuff. He doesn't seem to be doing too well. Which kind of makes me wonder, like, he's got the world's strongest man title. That almost feels like it's kind of marking him. I could imagine there's plenty of people gunning for him because, again, if he's the pinnacle, you beat him, you become the top dog. But Whitebeard basically says before he even read the letter, he knows it's about Blackbeard and Ace. So it's interesting that Shanks is even concerned with that, and that he's curious about Blackbeard and Ace, but even more so that, again, Shanks and Whitebeard are almost kind of placed on equal pedestals. That's the impression I get to a certain extent, because Whitebeard is like, he'll need to come here if he wants to talk to me. Which is funny, because that's exactly what the world government was trying to avoid. And then you see Shanks, and he just has one of the most Shanks reactions, because he's just laughing his head off. Like, that's kind of funny. He's not at all concerned or afraid of going to see Whitebeard. The only thing someone in his crew mentions is the world government isn't going to like that. But again, it feels to me like Shanks holds himself like he's basically on Whitebeard's level. So that's another fascinating detail. But it feels like a lot is kind of being set up, especially when Shanks says, yeah, he's going to go and sail for Whitebeard. So are they going to fight? Is it going to escalate into a fight? Are they going to team up? Like, I just don't know. So many possibilities at this point. And I feel like I'm repeating myself, but we go from a great scene to another great scene, because we go back to Mocktown and it's Blackbeard picking up Luffy's bounty with the 100 million berry bounty, and he's a little confused, and he says something that's interesting because he's like, in terms of ambitious spirit, I didn't even think he was worth 30 million, which I don't exactly know what he means by ambitious spirit. He can just tell like Luffy isn't that ambitious, but Luffy is ambitious, so I don't really know what to make of that. But then we get to see the introduction of Blackbeard's crew. Some of the guys we had seen before, they were kind of rowdy and making a mess. Nobody really knew who they were in town though. Like, plenty of onlookers said like, who's that guy? It was kind of funny that the two most dangerous crews in town, people weren't really that aware of, Luffy's crew and Blackbeard's crew. And when they showed Blackbeard's name, Marshall D. Teach, that changed up a lot about how I viewed the D initial in their names, because immediately I was like, okay, well, he's being set up as a villain. I don't think the D means something like, oh, you're a good person. Okay, not that I thought it meant that, but I went through all the things of what I thought D could have meant. Like, and I could probably make a longer video speculating. I don't know. I've been told nobody really knows up to this point. At first I thought, okay, maybe it's Dawn, because like Romance Dawn. Then I kind of left that one. And then the next thing I thought of is maybe it's more dreams. But the more and more I thought about it, I was like, no, I actually don't think it's dreams. And I even go back to this kind of ominous panel, and I could be reading way too much into this panel, but back in Luffy's home village, in Fuchsia Village, I think it's called, everyone is celebrating for Luffy because it's like, yes, he's living his dream, he's becoming a pirate, and his mayor just says something like quite ominous, just looking out his dream, or his destiny. And that's always kind of stuck with me. It just kind of nags in the back of my brain. More so because, again, I feel like the D has something to do with destiny more so. And I feel like destiny is something that's being stressed more and more so as I go throughout One Piece. Like, these people, they think that they're living out their dreams, but they're just living out their destinies. And so D to me almost signals that you have a massive destiny. You're the ones that kind of move the plot along, so to speak. Everyone else just kind of responds to what you do. But the thing is, Blackbeard's doctor, this weird Doc Q guy who rides the horse, he ran into Luffy earlier, offered him an apple, and when it didn't blow up, he was like, you're lucky. But he says something interesting here when thinking of Luffy and him being worth 100 million berries. He says, precisely, destiny always measures a person's worth. And so again, the fact that Blackbeard and Luffy both have the D initial in their name, it's like, it probably doesn't necessarily mean something good. At first I thought it was dreams, but I'm assuming because he keeps getting stressed, it might be destiny. Like those who are destined to do great and terrible things. But again, I'm just speculating here. I know I've probably spent too long talking about this. I will say one last thing that I wanted to make note of, because I thought it was interesting, was that the real-life Blackbeard was named Edward Teach, and it seems like One Piece split up his name, gave half of it to Whitebeard, Edward Newgate, and then the other half it gave Marshall D. Teach to Blackbeard. I thought that was kind of interesting. But the arc is really drawing to a close at this point, and Luffy, he arrives back just in time before they have to leave. And the thing is, it took him all night to get back, because he spent most of the time looking for a beetle. But he arrives back with Cricket's gold, he gives him the gold, and at first Cricket seems to be a little cold with Luffy. I don't exactly know why, but he's like, hey, you gotta get going. And then after thinking for a bit, Cricket goes and he says a final goodbye to him. And he says something interesting. Remember, no one in history ever disproved the City of Gold or the Sky Island. People might laugh and call it foolish logic, but it's enough for me. That's what romanticism is all about. And again, romance is a massive theme, especially of this arc, but really this whole series, because how did it begin? It began with Romance Dawn. But anyway, Luffy's entire crew goes out to where they need to, and this is when Blackbeard shows up. And Blackbeard is clearly going after Luffy because he thinks, okay, this is going to be the big catch I can give to the government. But it's almost like Destiny was stepping in to say, okay, you two aren't supposed to fight quite yet. Because all of a sudden the knock-up stream pushes Luffy's boat way up into the sky, and they're riding it up. Blackbeard's entire ship gets wrecked. And I honestly think at this point in their story, especially because Ace is going after Blackbeard and Blackbeard is trying to become a warlord, that if they fought, Blackbeard is probably a little too strong for Luffy at this point. I would assume so. I could be wrong about that. I mean, because I guess Luffy technically defeated one of the warlords. But again, it doesn't matter because they didn't fight. But it is something to look forward to in the future because they really set it up like, okay, these two, they're two sides of the same coin. Their destinies are forever intertwined. And I wanted to quickly talk about this last scene we see of Blackbeard and his crew. Now, it's not technically in the JAYA arc since it's one of the first scenes in Skypiea, but I also thought it would be more appropriate to talk about it here. So personally, I love this scene. It builds up a lot of anticipation, and they are setting up that him and Luffy are going to run into each other. In fact, Blackbeard all but says it, because he's just laughing, which is kind of an interesting detail. Like, he's not upset at all. Even one of his crewmates, he gets kind of upset, like, wait, why is this so funny to you? He got away. But Blackbeard and the other two members of his crew basically say, well, you know, we're going to run into him again. And they heavily stress that destiny is kind of funny, again, hinting at the fact that their two destinies, these two crews' destinies, are forever intertwined. So I just wanted to make one last note of that scene because all the Blackbeard stuff is interesting. They're setting up something big in the future. Not to mention the fact that the guy is named Blackbeard. You don't just give that name to any pirate. He's going to have a big role. But I gotta say, I love the way the arc ends with them just flying up to Sky Island. And as the One Piece music is kicking in, they're just so excited to be going on this great adventure. And it seems to be working up to this point. Now, obviously, they actually get up there. They get to Skypiea. But great arc overall. Still one of my favorite arcs I've seen up to this point. That's not even to say I think it's one of the very best arcs, although it is up there. I'm simply saying more so from a personal preference. It was just so world building rich with information and details and new characters and places. So for that reason, really loved it. But next on to Skypiea. Now to dive into the Skypiea arc, overall I enjoyed it, but I also know it's one of the more divisive arcs, and I fully understand the reasons why people might not like this arc. But at the same time, especially when I consider the way this arc closed, in my opinion, it had an incredibly strong closing that kind of carries, or at least washes away a lot of the problems I had with it. So overall, I liked it, but I didn't like every aspect of it. And I'll talk about the stuff I liked and the stuff I didn't like. And I truly believe it is very important to the One Piece story, especially with what happens towards the end. Now, I will say, because I covered some of the moments in this arc, I'll try not to overcover them, particularly some of the moments at the end, like the backstory and some of the discoveries I think that they make. If you want more in-depth videos on those are on my channel. But again, this is more so just me trying to talk about the overall arc and more so the moments I haven't talked about too much. But even to dive into this arc, it is kind of interesting how they immediately arrive in the White Sea and they probably realize they don't know quite what they signed up for, because they get attacked by Whitebeard. And again, Whitebeard is one of those characters I have kind of a love-hate relationship with, or I should say, I didn't like him to start, because again, it felt like he just mostly attacked the crew and was kind of mean, but I started to like him as the arc went on. But obviously, he attacked them. Then you have this other knight, Gunfall, show up. He protects the Straw Hats. He seems quite nice, but it is kind of interesting how the moment they arrive up in the sky, they immediately find themselves in this conflict that's been going on for hundreds of years, and they have no idea what they walked into. But Gunfall's quite nice. He kind of introduces himself as the Sky Knight. They end up going up and immediately are declared illegal, so that doesn't sound good, and it's just such an ominous warning right from the start. I do kind of like how everywhere the crew goes, they probably think like, okay, we're going on some sort of vacation or just fun trip. But as the viewer, you kind of know, like, okay, there are no fun trips for you guys. I mean, maybe you'll have fun, but it's going to be chaotic. Like, they keep getting involved in revolutions and saving entire civilizations and peoples, and they just want a fun adventure. They always get more than they bargain for, but quickly they arrive in Skypiea, and it is beautiful. It is such a different culture, but just this beautiful land in the clouds. It almost feels like heaven to a certain extent, which is kind of funny or ironic because the people are living in despair and fear every single day because they have a tyrant of a god just looking over them. So again, looks can be deceiving. In fact, in One Piece, they almost certainly are. But again, one of the things I definitely appreciate about One Piece is all the unique character designs, but even the unique cultural designs. And you can see based on the way that the people look or the way that the people dress, they have a very different culture from the Blue Sea dwellers, so that's kind of interesting. However, it doesn't take long for the Straw Hats to meet some of the locals, particularly Conus and her father, but it's nice to kind of get introduced to the Sky Island culture through Conus and her father. They're showing them all the technology that they use with the dials, the breath dials, and the impact dials, and all sorts of dials that make their lives easier. And I love this technology, how it's just so foreign and different. They even show off the waiver and how Nami uses the waiver to go about. But of course, it doesn't take Nami long to realize, like, this heaven that they've come to, not so much of a heaven. And she learns that the brutal way because she comes across this unique island, which is the only place with Earth up here, which even from the start definitely was a little curious. Like, wait, why is there Earth up here? Why is this the only place with Earth up here? Which granted, like, I didn't immediately clue it in. I probably should have been paying closer attention, but it does make perfect sense when they explain that that was the missing piece of Jaya that ended up here. But it is such a prized piece of land, and the details slowly start to add up. Like, you got the Shandians up here who don't really like the Sky people, and you've got this god who also seems to have kind of a tyrannical rule over everyone. Like, there is just a lot of mystery, and I like the way that it's kind of introduced. But on the other hand, Nami returns, and quickly you realize, like, okay, they've run into the authorities, and these authorities are just corrupt. Because again, they are slapping them with crime after crime after crime. They're never going to be able to pay it off. They end up getting into a fight, which, you know, that's not a good thing to necessarily get into the fight with the authorities of a place you've just gone to. But if that's not bad enough, then those authorities give them an even more ominous warning that, okay, now you've done it. Now you're going to incur the wrath of God. So again, the fact that there's a god up here and it's like, what exactly is going on? My initial thought was that maybe this god was more of like a Wizard of Oz wizard or something like that, where he's kind of a phony that just relies on cheap tricks. And even Nami got to witness God's power firsthand. And I like how they slowly introduce God. They don't like immediately show you him. They show you some of his feats of power. And this guy with some sort of lightning shock obliterates this trespasser to God's island, to Upper Yard. That's not a good sign. Like, what exactly have they signed up for? They've clearly gone into a place they have no understanding of, with this long conflict and just so much going on. But again, I was very excited at this point. Now, I was starting to feel like, okay, I want things to happen a little bit faster at this point, and to be fair, they did, because then Conus and her father, although we don't know it was them quite yet, they betray the Straw Hats. And they tell God about the Straw Hats, so this giant lobster carries away their ship with half of the Straw Hats to Upper Yard. So the other half is left behind, and they're like, okay, well, we gotta go to Upper Yard. So you have Luffy, Sanji, and Usopp. They're heading with Conus because they're like, okay, we gotta head to Upper Yard, we gotta go and get his ship. And halfway there, she kind of breaks down because she realizes, like, okay, what I did was wrong. And the thing is, even while she's saying that and breaking down, I was kind of thinking, like, maybe I just wasn't taking it seriously enough. Although I do feel sorry for her to a certain extent, because she genuinely felt bad for betraying them. But I'm just thinking from the perspective of, well, Luffy actually wanted to go to Upper Yard because he heard that's where God was, and he kind of wanted to fight God. So you've kind of given him what he wanted, although you did betray them. And they're not even upset that she betrayed them, and they're upset that she's telling them now, because again, I don't really know how yet, and it's only revealed later, but somehow God can hear the conversations of everyone, and he hears that Conus has essentially betrayed him. He sends out another attack, and something about God's attacks that he has in this arc is that I love the sound design and the visuals, But just in time, Gunfall's able to swoop in, save Conus, and Luffy and the rest of them are just happy she's safe. They head on their way. But again, this is kind of chaotic, and at this point, I'm definitely excited because it feels like some stuff has started to happen. Now, to be fair, this next part was not nearly as good as I was hoping. In theory, you would think like, okay, it's kind of cool how they separated the crew half and half, and they're in a foreign place with a whole bunch of enemies. Hopefully this works, but again, I don't really think it was executed that well. It felt like certain fights lasted way too long. But either way, you have Luffy, Sanji, and Usopp. They're heading, and they come across these ordeals, and they get to pick one of the 4 ordeals. And each of them coincides with one of the 4 gods' priests, and somehow they choose the worst one. Like, I don't even know if there was a right answer, but there was definitely a wrong answer, which was to pick the ball ordeal. Because again, they get Satori, and this guy is so freaking annoying. And the thing is, their fight with him, not only is he annoying and he has this dumb laugh where he's like, ha ha ha. He just got on my nerves so much. But not only was that annoying, but he was actually beating them down, and it lasted what felt like several episodes. It probably wasn't even that long. But again, it was one of those things where I wasn't enjoying the experience at all, and I just wanted them to get on with it. And I even stopped watching One Piece for a while because of that fight with Satori. I just was not enjoying it. I thought the pacing on it was bad. So I went like a month or something like that without even watching One Piece, because every time I would think of like, okay, what do I want to watch? Do I want to watch One Piece? I would just think back to like, oh, they're fighting Satori. Okay, maybe I'll watch something else. But again, not a fan of that. Now, there was one aspect of it, just one, that I actually did kind of like, is that they introduced this cool power, Mantra or Mantra. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. Like, I've heard it pronounced, but I always get it wrong. So again, with some of these pronunciations, if I mess them up, please bear with me. But that's kind of cool because it essentially allows you to predict movements. So that's definitely something that the crew needs to learn how to do. And I assume it will come up even outside of Skypiea. But thankfully they're able to defeat him and continue on with their journey. It just lasted so long and it was so irritating. Now the other part of the crew, that stuff was a little better, but ZORO, Nami, and Robin all leave Chopper. Now he agrees to stay behind on this ship, on this sacrificial altar, but it was a bad idea to leave Chopper alone on this boat. And even when I think of it, like, I feel kind of sorry for Chopper. It hasn't been that long, well, one, since the start of the journey, but it especially hasn't been that long since Chopper even joined the crew. Like, sometimes it feels a lot longer than it has, but if you just look at the actual time that's lapsed, it hasn't been that long. And Chopper is still dealing with tons of past trauma, so I just felt kind of bad for leaving him there. But I do think he shines at moments in this arc. Like, even here when he gets attacked by one of God's priests, Shura. Now, although the situation isn't funny, the moment is where Chopper just blows Gunfall's whistle and the face he makes is just hilarious. I don't even know why it was so funny. Now, what happens next isn't so funny, because then Shura starts burning down the ship. However, I do love the fact that Chopper, he cares so much about the ship because he cares so much about the crew that he's even burning himself. He's ripping off the mast so it doesn't all break. But again, I felt so bad that they left Chopper on his own. Now, Gunfall shows up and tries to protect Chopper, but he ends up losing as well. And I will say, one of the things that I kind of liked about the power scaling, and I try not to overpower scale these things, but they're really setting up like, okay, these priests are strong. One of them took out the former god, and that was something else that was revealed that I forgot to mention, is that everyone knows that Gunfall was the former god before the new god took over, but one of the new god's priests is stronger than the old god. Meanwhile, another one of God's priests, although he lost, gave Luffy, Sanji, and Usopp a ton of trouble. So at this point I was definitely wondering, like, wait, if they're this strong, and they're only priest of God, how strong is this god, and how is anyone going to be able to defeat him? But I will say, out of the 3 split up groups, the part that I liked the best was Robin, ZORO, and Nami, because they're on their way, they're kind of just having fun exploring. I enjoyed that the most out of these 3 groups. Especially when they come across the other half of Cricket's house in Jaya, and they immediately start to realize, especially Nami puts it together, like, oh, this is the missing piece of Jaya. And even they think of Noland's last words, that clue. And again, that clue didn't really make a ton of sense, but then it makes perfect sense. That the gold was in the skull's right eye. And when you think of the missing piece of Jaya and you put it together on a map, and you realize, okay, so that's where the gold is. That's where the City of Gold is. The City of Gold is up here in Upper Yard. It was just perfect, and it definitely got me excited to see where the story would go. I mean, in hindsight, it probably should have made sense that, like, okay, they've been talking about the City of Gold. It's probably going to be up in the sky. And one of the other things I wanted to note is wherever Luffy goes, he always causes this chain of events, this ripple effect he can't really control. Because even when they defeated one of God's priests, that signaled to the Shandians, particularly this girl Isa, who becomes important, especially because Luffy kind of inspires her, much like Shanks inspired Luffy. But she also has this mantra ability where she's able to listen to people's inner voices and tell, like, if they're alive, if they're awake, if they're in certain positions and stuff like that. And she basically tells them one of the priest's voices is gone. So the Shandians attack. They're not really able to do anything. They retreat. But there is a brief encounter where Whitebeard runs into Luffy and he basically tells him, like, get out of my land, basically. And the more I do learn about the Shandians, like, on the one hand, I understand that they're trying to get back their homeland. On the other hand, it seems like Whitebeard and some of the Shandians might just get in the Straw Hat's way, so I hope that doesn't happen. But if they only had a conversation, they could work together. It's just a shame that they didn't for the longest time. But regardless, the Shandians retreat. All the Straw Hats meet back at the ship and they're wondering what actually happened. Now, I will say one of the highlights of this arc was when Luffy, Sanji, and Usopp were following this river all throughout the forest, and it was almost like a roller coaster at points. But even some of the views that they had were just magnificent, with the clouds and the sunset and just the forest. I just loved some of those views. But everyone arrives back. They do wonder what happened to the ship. Now, Chopper, he feels bad enough at this point. But I love that even Usopp is like, Chopper, are you okay? Like, Usopp definitely cares a lot about the ship. Probably more so than everyone else because, again, it was a gift from Kaya. But in that moment, that's all Chopper needed to hear, is that they weren't upset with him, which granted, they weren't, because again, you can replace a ship, you can rebuild parts of a ship, but you can't replace a life. Now, I do think one of the highlights of this entire arc is kind of this party that they have. Now, at first, it's just a barbecue. They're eating up all these sky sharks, and they're discussing the plan for tomorrow, basically saying that, okay, we know that the City of Gold has been up here all along, that this was the missing piece of Jaya, this and that. And then it all just goes off the rails and you have some wolves show up and they start dancing around this fire and it's kind of crazy. Someone in a comment on one of my recent videos said that when they're dancing around this bonfire up in Skypiea, that was one of Oda's favorite panels he ever drew. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but if that's the case, that's kind of cool. But there are two other moments that I wanted to briefly discuss because I really do enjoy them. One of the moments is with Whitebeard back at his encampment, and at this point I wasn't really sure what to think of Whitebeard. Like, I wanted to like him because I felt like, okay, I probably should, because he seems like he's fighting for a just cause. But one, I don't know enough about him, and two, any interaction that anyone has had with him has not been positive. So I understand the reason he is the way he is after learning more about him. But again, this moment here was kind of cool because he just has such a determined look and he's looking out at his homeland and he's saying, like, tomorrow I'm going to take it, or I'm basically going to die trying. And just seeing that determination is great because you often see that determination in the characters of our crew. So Whitebeard is obviously someone who's not part of the crew. He's just one of the native Shandians. However, he exemplifies some of those same characteristics, and I kind of like seeing that. The other moment I wanted to talk about from this particular night is when you have three of God's priests. They go up to go and meet God, and just this whole temple thing is kind of cool. I don't know, I love it, because it genuinely feels like they went up to Olympus, or they went up to, like, the heavens itself to go and converse with God, even though they went up some beanstalk. But I like how these priests have been established as they're pretty strong. And then Eneru, and this is the first time we actually see him. We saw his powers, and I liked the slow lead up. He comes out of nowhere, shocks them, immediately puts them in their place, showing he's way stronger, calls them weak, and is like, I'm God. That was a pretty great introduction, or first introduction on the screen. But more so than that, this guy, this Eneru guy, has, in my opinion, one of the better character designs. I mean, it's unique. Like, some of the features are a little strange, like the really long earlobes and the giant ring coming out of his back. There's a lot of religious symbols around this arc in particular that Eneru has, which I guess makes sense because he refers to himself as God. Like, he literally has a God complex. He thinks of himself as God. He wants to be called God. his title is basically God, but at the same time, I like how they're kind of building it up like, okay, he thinks himself God, he's about to be humbled by a monkey from the blue sea as he's going to call Luffy, and I love that because it even harps back to the whole Sun Wukong and Luffy connection, because again, Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, he fought against the gods. Luffy, a monkey from the blue sea trying to become king, is going to fight against God, so the parallels are there. I just love how they're setting this guy up to be perfectly humbled. But regardless, the next day, everything is going to go down, and Eneru has been talking about these games he's going to host. And again, he literally treats people's lives as games. They are pretty worthless to him. And even one of the details that I kind of like about Eneru is that it's pretty subtle, but the way he looks at people, he looks at so many people with this look of indifference. Not like I feel anything towards you, anger or hate or love or jealousy, but he looks at the vast majority of people like you are beneath me. I don't even have any sort of feelings to you because you're worthless to me. You are like insects to him. Now, of course, he shows a little bit more emotion when he fights against Luffy and stuff like that. And one of the other things I did want to add is I love Eneru's laugh and even his whole demeanor. It's a little different from a lot of the characters we've seen up to this point. I guess I would say the closest thing is perhaps Arlong, where he almost has this cool, calm, and collected demeanor, is a tyrant who has taken over a place. Like, in many ways, Arlong and Eneru are kind of close. Like, Arlong believes himself way above other people, like literally superior, and Eneru believes himself God. I think, unless I'm mistaken, that's probably the closest connection. And another moment I wanted to talk about quickly, because it just is kind of weird overall, but I also wonder if it has future implications, is the Straw Hat ship, the Going Merry, obviously got wrecked. However, Usopp wakes up in the middle of the night and he appears to see a ghost working on it, and it's not like he was hallucinating or dreaming because the ship is fixed when everyone wakes up. So again, I think it was just a friendly ghost, like maybe the ship is kind of haunted, but not necessarily. It's almost like an unofficial crew member, this ghost thing, or like I don't really know for sure, but it also opens up so many implications into the One Piece world, because then it clearly shows that there's ghosts and spirits and all sorts of mysterious beings out here, which shouldn't be a shock at all, and I guess it isn't when I really think about it. It's just kind of funny that their ship is probably like haunted. I don't know if haunted is the right word, but they have like this ghost or a friendly spirit show up and help them, almost like it's an unofficial crew member or something like that. I do wonder if there will be like little hints. Maybe stuff will go missing from time to time in the ship. Again, for all I know, this scene means nothing, but with One Piece, it always keeps you guessing, because even things that might seem like they have no meaning turn out to have massive payoffs, and some other moments do go nowhere. But yeah, the next day, everything is about to go down. The Straw Hats split into two groups. One of the groups is taking the boat the long way around. They have Gunfall. The other group has Luffy, Robin, Zoro, and Chopper, and I love how this is a different group than the other groups that split up yesterday. Now, of course, nothing goes to plan. They get attacked by a giant snake that kind of separates them, but I will say it does create some of the funniest moments of this arc, but really the funniest moments I've seen in all of One Piece. So anyway, they're all separated. That didn't go well. You have the Shandians attacking. Immediately, that doesn't go well. They all get caught except Wiper, and he has a pretty cool moment where he takes out one of God's priests. That moment really made me like him, and it is interesting that we start to learn more about Gunfall, and just learning that he made a lot of mistakes, and he's talking to them quite honestly, or as honestly as he can be, about the fact that, yeah, he was God of this land, and he knows that it was wrong, but his ancestors stole the land from the Shandians, and that's what they're trying to take back. His people, the Skypieans, depend on this land now, so again, it's not as easy for them as just giving it back because they know it would technically be the right thing. And I can kind of understand, like, it's a very difficult situation, but at the same time, it does make his character a little bit more complex. Kind of a crazy situation the Straw Hats just came up to. But yeah, you have all sorts of fighting. Some of the moments are kind of funny. You have Chopper running from goat men. Like, that's a legitimate thing. They're Eneru's men. You have Zoro start fighting with some of the Shandians, but the funniest part about Zoro's mini adventures is he starts bullying the Southbird. Like, it's this whole expedition he basically has with this Southbird that even ends up with him getting carried way up into the sky. So it was kind of funny, but also kind of random, like what is going on here? I will say I really liked Robin's role in this arc in particular, because again, Robin is one of those characters that often doesn't really feel like part of the crew yet. Like, I keep wanting to remind myself that, yeah, like Robin's part of the crew, but so many times I'd be watching this arc and I would forget about Robin, and then she'd pop up on the screen and I would feel bad, like, oh, I forgot Robin was part of the crew. I forgot she was up here, despite the fact that I literally think she's one of the most valuable crew members. And I don't mean that from a sentimental standpoint, but rather from a literal value standpoint of what value can she provide to the crew with helping them achieve their dreams, of helping them get to the One Piece and help Luffy become king of the pirates. And I think I explain a little bit more as we get towards the end of the arc. But even so, she wanted to give up on life, and Luffy saved her. She thought her dream was over. She thought she'd never have a chance of finding the lost history of the world. And then all of a sudden, barely having joined Luffy's crew, they find themselves in the legendary ruins of the city of Shandora. And I love how excited she's getting as she's basically going all about and realizing like, oh, okay, so my dream isn't dead. I've been able to learn more in the last couple of days than I had been up to this point. So again, I loved seeing that for Robin, and one of the things I really liked during this arc is particularly towards the end, well, one, she realizes something even bigger, but two, she realizes something else more on a personal level, and that's that she really likes the crew, that they're a bunch of crazy people, but they're her crazy people. Now overall, I think some of these fights were overdone as far as the length, and there was a lot of fighting happening all at once. I did like Robin's fight with this one really big guy who was destroying all the runes. Again, this guy was a little weird. He kept making weird animal noises, but again, he didn't seem to be all with it, but he was destroying all the runes. And just seeing how scary Robin can get when she's very pissed off, it was awesome to see. I mean, like, Robin totally destroyed this guy. So it was a great reminder that, yeah, Robin is very strong, but she also has so much value with the intelligence and just the real world experience that she actually has. Now, another cool character moment was Chopper's fight with one of God's priests, Gadatsu. I was genuinely shocked he beat this guy. Like, Chopper soloed one of God's priests. Meanwhile, some of the priests gave the other crew members tons of trouble. But again, seeing Chopper win, but also seeing the pure excitement he had, like, yes, I'm a pirate. I've proven it. I'm a pirate. That was just awesome to see, especially because Chopper's someone who has, until very recently, struggled with self-worth. So seeing that aspect was great for him. Now, while all the fighting was going on, I did kind of like to see Eneru just showing up at places and just obliterating people. Particularly, there was this one guy where he had this epic monologue. It's one of my favorite Eneru moments, where he tells this guy, his name is Kamakiri, he's like the second or maybe third strongest of the Shandians. It's like, I'll give you 5 minutes, I won't move from this spot. And over time, you see this Kamakiri guy, he is just realizing, like, I can't even touch this guy. And this is when Eneru has this great speech. He's like, I am lightning. I am literally nature itself. I am the fear mankind has. I am God. And then he just obliterates this man. But again, this is where one of the weakest points of the entire arc comes up. Because as much as I want to like Eneru as a villain, he has so many characteristics that I think make him a great villain. I would have liked to see maybe his story fleshed out a little bit more. But overall, I thought he was a pretty good villain. Maybe not quite as good or on the same level as Crocodile in my opinion. However, at points, I do kind of wish One Piece would go into maybe some of the villains' backstories. But again, a lot of the shock value, no pun intended, of Eneru as a villain is undercut by the fact that basically everyone survives his attacks. Even attacks that feel like, okay, without a doubt that person is dead, and everyone walks it off. Which I don't want to be overly harsh, because I know One Piece doesn't like to kill off a ton of people, and I want to be clear, I'm not a fan of death for shock value's sake. Again, no pun intended. But I also do feel like One Piece kind of cheats at times with the fake out deaths where they want the impact of a death, but they don't want the actual consequences of that character actually dying. And again, the fact that basically no one died from Eneru's attacks, it does to a certain extent cheapen his impact as a villain, and it does kind of cheapen just the destruction he actually caused. And Eneru even kind of randomly shows up on the Straw Hat ship, which I remember it being like such a random thing, thinking like, oh, like he can't be here was my first thought. No one stands a chance against him here. And clearly not, because he was only there to taunt Gunfall, tell him about this game and how he was going to leave. But he didn't leave before shocking Sanji and then shocking Usopp, and he basically sidelined them for a good portion of the arc. In fact, there was a point where I forgot Sanji and Usopp were even in this arc. No one here has a chance against Eneru, but I was also kind of putting it together like, well, no one does except someone who could kind of deal with electricity. Who would that be? Maybe a rubber person, because rubber is an insulator of electricity, so it doesn't allow electricity to pass through. But speaking of Luffy, he did have a brief encounter with Viper, and I was trying to like Viper, but then he has moments like this, which make it harder. Now, to be fair, I still do like Viper, especially with what happens after this towards the end of the arc. But he just starts attacking Luffy, and they're fighting each other, and then Luffy gets eaten by a snake, and he's just in the snake for a massive portion of the arc. Like, the vast majority of characters forget about him, which in some ways does have a nice payoff, although it does last a long time. Like, even a lot of the highlights of this fighting and stuff like that, the problem is they often overstay their welcome or last a little too long. Luffy inside the snake has many funny moments, especially because he thinks he's in a cave and he keeps fighting it. So that part of it is funny, but again, it does last a long time. However, I do like that it's setting up this payoff, like even Eneru is going to forget all about Luffy, because Eneru has this death game going on, and he was even trying to speculate like how many people are going to be left. But anyway, the amount of people left fighting is dwindling, and they're all kind of converging on one spot. And something I do like is that Conus and her father felt bad enough about betraying the Straw Hats, even though they don't really care, to be honest. But they wanted to go to Upper Yard to make sure that the Straw Hats got out of Skypiea safely, and on the way they picked up Isa, the Shandian girl, who again, I do like the connection she kind of forms with Luffy. Now before they meet up with Nami, Nami does have a moment where her and Gunfall team up to fight Satori's brothers, which again, I don't want to ever hear that name again, Satori, it still gives me PTSD. His brothers weren't much better. The only thing better about them is that they were on screen less time, but I don't know what Oda was thinking with these characters. If he was just trying to piss me off with them, well, mission successful. But it was cool to see Nami, who doesn't usually fight, team up with Gunfall to defeat those two. One of the standout fights, to me at least, was ZORO versus Ohm. This was really the only fight between the priests that I actually liked. Sure, Viper versus Shura was a cool moment, but it wasn't so much of a fight. But the reason I like this ZORO fight so much is because throughout the arc, they were setting up that ZORO is working on this one ranged attack. So it didn't come out of nowhere. Even in other arcs, ZORO had been working towards it, but I really love how this showed he took a major step up, because even when I was first introduced to the world's strongest swordsman, Mihawk, I was a little curious, like, wait, how did he use a ranged attack to slice through a ship? I thought maybe it had to do with his sword or something like that. Now I'm starting to realize that if you just get to a certain level as a swordsman, there are so many cool things you can do. So again, seeing ZORO do that, I thought was a highlight of the arc, at least to me. Now, I would definitely be remiss if I didn't mention this one moment, because on the one hand, it is such a beautiful moment. When I only look at what happens in this moment, it shows the potential of what this arc could have been. And don't get me wrong, overall, as I've said, I did like this arc. It had plenty of great moments, but there are some key things that definitely drag down how impactful this arc can be in its entirety. This moment exemplifies one of them perfectly, and it is such a shame because it could have been such a great moment. So what exactly am I talking about? Well, one of Eneru's prisoners escaped. He finds Conus and her father, and he's trying to warn them about Eneru's evil plan. He's going to destroy all of Skypiea, and he's going to fly away on his Arc Maxim. Okay, so they clearly have to go and warn everyone. And on the one hand, it does raise the stakes of what happens in the final conflict, which is something that I felt this arc was generally lacking up to this point. Now sure, there's a lot going on, but I definitely felt a certain lack of stakes heading into the final conflict, especially in comparison to Alabasta. And I'm not just talking about like tangible stakes, but even emotional stakes. Like with Alabasta, there was so much emotion going on. Now, to be fair, I do think that the Noland and Calgara backstory does help with a lot of those stakes, with the bell and just everything that happens there. So I love the way the arc concludes. But this moment here, every time I think about it, it reminds me of just one of the major complaints I have about this arc. Because Eneru can hear what's going on, which again, Eneru is such a cool villain. He's not a good person, I think we can all agree. But from his design, to his character, to his power level. Personally, I think he's one of the cooler villains that's been introduced. But he's able to hear everything because of the electrical currents and his powers. And he's obviously able to do these ranged attacks where he just basically drops the heavens on someone with a massive lightning bolt. And I love that in this moment, Konis's father knows what's about to happen, and in his last moment, he pushes his daughter out of the way to safety, and it is so beautiful. It's just the last act of a loving father is to make sure his daughter survives, so then she can go and warn everyone, which she does, which is obviously a big thing Konis did. And just seeing how Eneru obliterated them was phenomenal. Now, it was sad, it was tragic, it was all these things, but this was a moment where without a doubt I was like, yeah, that guy is dead. It was such a beautiful sacrifice and a beautiful moment, right up to the point where you find out he survived, like barely an inconvenience. And again, this arc has so many good things going for it, but moments like this remind me of all the things dragging it down. For one, the fact that everyone is surviving removes stakes. Another thing, I kind of feel cheated as an audience member, like you're just trying to trick the audience when you do these fake out deaths like this. Like either do a death or don't. I really hate being faked out because when a character does actually die, it's going to cheapen that actual moment because I'll wonder like, okay, maybe they can survive. And another reason I hate moments like this is that it kind of nerfs Eneru. Like this man winds up some of the strongest attacks I've seen in One Piece, and it's like barely even a shock, like you plug something into the socket wrong, or you know, there was a loose wire or something like that, and it gave you a bit of a zap. Anyway, so I did have to vent about that moment because it truly pissed me off. Now, Eneru does bring the remaining survivors down to the Shandian ruins, and you get to see the ancient city of Shandora. The only thing is, all of the gold is gone because Eneru already took all the gold to put on his giant ship, his ark, that he's going to sail away on. Now, I do kind of like this moment where Eneru has the remaining survivors in front of him, and he essentially tells them about his evil plan, or his more evil plan, because he's already been executing his evil plan, but he's going to leave on his Ark Maxim. He's heading for Endless Earth, or he calls it Endless Verth, which was definitely kind of interesting because I know the One Piece world is primarily water, so I was assuming another planet. I wasn't assuming the moon. What exactly is on the moon then? And he's saying like, okay, the remaining survivors are going to be able to come with him. Now, he does say he's going to destroy all of Skypiea on the way out, so obviously none of the survivors want to go with him, at least not willingly, so they all attack him. It doesn't go well for any of them. Now, Whitebeard does surprise me, and this moment here makes me like Whitebeard even more, because Whitebeard uses some Sea Prism Stone so he can grab Eneru, and he knows this is going to severely hurt himself, but he's going to use the reject dial on himself, and he uses it, and I didn't expect it to be nearly as effective as it was. Like, Eneru literally had to restart his heart, but obviously it didn't work, so at this point he feels pretty untouchable. There's no one left to take him on. He literally believes he's won. And this is what I love so much about Luffy being in the snake, is again, Eneru's thought he's won at this point. So the fact is, he thinks he's at his highest and he's about to be humbled by what he calls a monkey from the blue sea. It is just a perfect setup in my mind, and I really loved that aspect of it. Even if I didn't love how long Luffy was in the snake, because it was a big portion of this arc, this payoff was great. But Nami is trying to survive, so she's the last survivor. She agrees to go with Eneru. I don't think anyone blames her, at least I don't. Like, sure, do what you have to survive. It's not like she's hurting anyone. She goes with him, and he brings her to his Ark Maxim. And I love that Luffy gets out of the snake. Quickly, he runs to Eneru, and he has no respect for this guy, like none whatsoever. It's actually kind of funny. And Eneru is a little frustrated, like, okay. But then they start fighting, and obviously Eneru is in for a shock, no pun intended, when he realizes like, oh, I might be in trouble. Like, I can't hurt this guy. And that shocked face, like I've seen that even before I watched this arc, because it's just a meme that's used, but it's so funny. There's actually quite a few funny moments from this, like when Luffy turns off his brain. But it is kind of funny how you have this guy who views himself as God, and Luffy just beats him down in this fight. Like, it's not entirely one-sided, but it definitely ends kind of one-sided. Like, Luffy brings God to his knees, and again, like, Eneru at this point is like, please, no more. he tells him, I don't think I could take one more of those hits. So he uses some cheap tricks, obviously throws a golden ball around his arm and throws him off the ship. Now, at the same time, I do think it's kind of funny how that gold ball that he gave Luffy is also the thing Luffy uses to defeat him for good, but I'll talk more about that later. However, it's kind of funny that he thinks he's gotten rid of Luffy, but again, Luffy's not going to give up. So even though he goes all the way to the bottom, he just starts running to where he knows Eneru is heading, because Eneru he can't leave without getting the prized jewel of Shandora, this golden bell, which now he assumes is basically at the top of this beanstalk on one of these clouds somewhere. So Luffy and him are both running there. Now there is this other kind of good moment, I just thought I would mention it quickly, where Sanji and Usopp, who I thought were sidelined for the rest of the arc, they wake up, they quickly see, okay, Nami needs help. They find a way onto the ship. It's actually kind of impressive, especially the fact that Usopp and Nami end up in this kind of funny routine where they're just trying to avoid Eneru's attacks, but then Sanji essentially sacrifices himself. He takes the full brunt of Eneru's attack. But what I love the most is, despite the fact that Sanji bought time so that Usopp and Nami could escape, is that Usopp still grabbed onto the side of the ship so he could go back and get Sanji. I thought that was a great moment for Usopp because, again, even though he's a coward and this and that, it does show some progress, so I like that. But at this point, Eneru's heading towards the beanstalk for the gold bell. He's destroying all of Skypiea around him with massive lightning shocks because he believes it's his duty to remove it from the sky, which, I'll be honest, doesn't seem like the strongest of motivations. I kind of wish that maybe he would have expounded on that a little bit more. I mean, I know he believes it's unnatural and he has to remove it from the sky. I just wish that maybe it was a bit of a better reason, but regardless, it does raise the stakes at least because, okay, maybe his direct attacks don't kill people, but if he removes Skypiea from the sky, that will kill a lot of people. But obviously you have Luffy running up this beanstalk. He's not giving up with his gold ball. It's kind of a funny sight to see because, again, this guy's just not stopping. And just when it seems like we're going to get into the final confrontation, we go into this backstory. And I mentioned it in this other video where I covered the backstory in detail, so I won't go as in detail in this video. But I remember being slightly annoyed, like, what, a backstory now? But we see it's a young Wiper being told by, the village chief, the Shandian chief, about Calgara's greatest regret. And he's being told about his relationship with this long-lost friend of his, Mont Blanc Noland. And at first I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna watch it. I didn't expect it to be 3 episodes, and part of me wondered, oh, is this some more bad pacing with the Skypiean arc? But no, I didn't feel that at all with this particular backstory. It is my favorite backstory I've seen up to this point in One Piece. I know it's got a lot of competition. One Piece writes some great backstories, and I feel like overall aspects of them get better and better, but something I mentioned in that video is there's almost more impact with this backstory because it has such a sad ending, and the characters, their lives don't end well. In fact, after their lives, there's 400 years of suffering. So it is not a very happy backstory, and what follows is not happy at all. Whereas with a lot of the Straw Hats, they don't have happy backstories, but sometimes okay, they're gonna have happy conclusions because the Straw Hats join the crew. But I was not expecting to care this much about characters that lived over 400 years ago. But by the end of the backstory with Noland and Calgara, man, I love these characters so much. I just felt so connected with them. It even makes me want certain characters to be a little bit more fleshed out, even Wiper to a certain extent. Although Wiper was fleshed out a little bit more by extension of listening to this backstory and me understanding this backstory. So that was a big part of me actually understanding Wiper and then appreciating him more. But just learning about this unlikely friendship between people of entirely different cultures and worlds, and just entirely different worldviews, but Noland being called to the island of Jaya by listening to this gold bell. And I love this idea of this gold bell, which I didn't really understand, why is this gold bell so important? Why is it the center of this final conflict? Is it really that important? Why is everyone going after this gold bell? Why does Eneru care about it in particular? Well, he cares about it for a different reason, but Luffy understands the reason. But I love this idea that the ringing of the bell will be able to proclaim the existence of Shandora, and whoever needs to hear it will be able to hear it. It doesn't matter the distance. And I love how that has some serious implications to this final conflict between Luffy and Eneru, because again, Luffy understands all this, so he understands what happens if he rings that bell, as far as with Cricket down below and everything that he's learned up to this point, which is one of the things I love about Luffy. But now to the backstory, Noland arrives at this place and he sees they're going through some sort of plague, and he knows how he can save them, but you have so different cultures, like Calgara and him don't get along at first, and just seeing how Noland says like, I can save your people, but he needs Calgara's help to be able to do it, because Noland has the ingredients to, but unfortunately he was sandwiched in between some earth. It was very unfortunate for him, but it also set up the perfect circumstance where Calgara had to make a decision, especially when one of their gods, the snake, was nearly going to eat Noland. So in that moment, Calgara chose to believe Noland, even though it meant killing one of his gods. And just the symbolism behind it, and as Calgara is breaking down, was beautiful, because he's like, please, tell me you can save my people, and Noland says he can. And he does, and just seeing the friendship that blossoms between those two, and not just those two, but the Shandians and Noland's crew, even to the point where Calgara shows them their prized city of gold. And he offers them some of the gold, but what I love the most about it, and the most fascinating part, and I go into more detail in the other video, but the most fascinating part is that Calgara says they're not even protecting the gold, but rather they're protecting this Poneglyph. And that is one of the most interesting things to me, because that has so many implications on our crew, with Robin and Luffy, and I think with like the One Piece and the Lost History and all sorts of stuff, all sorts of mysteries in the One Piece world, I really do believe are tied to the Poneglyphs in particular. I don't fully understand them, but again, I think that they hold so much important information that will reveal more than people know. But yes, it opens up so many questions when he says Shandora fought and fell to protect this stone. Like, okay, who was trying to destroy the stone, or who was trying to get their hands on the stone, or who was trying to use the stone? Like, what exactly is going on here? Even the different sides, like, was it a good and bad side? Was it more gray? Was it just differences of opinion? But regardless, then you have this sad moment in the backstory as well, where all of the Shandians turn on Noland and his crew because they cut down some of their sacred trees, only to learn at the last possible minute as Noland was sailing away, after they had basically cast them out and said, you're not welcome here anymore, only to learn that the reason Noland cut down those trees, those sacred trees, was because they were diseased, and he knew in order to protect their people from future plagues, he would have to do that. And just seeing that shot of Calgara run to the shore as fast as he could and just break down and say, please come back, friend of mine. And he's saying, I'll keep ringing that bell so you'll be able to find your way back. And you just know in that moment, which makes it all the more tragic, Noland's never going to come back. At least, he's never going to see Calgara ever again. And Noland says, yes, of course I'll return. And this next part is a little frustrating, but it also makes sense because Noland was honest almost to a fault, because he's telling everyone about the City of Gold, which again, like, Noland, why are you telling people about the City of Gold? That's going to endanger the inhabitants of it, because again, people are greedy by nature. They want gold. It's not going to end well. But he tells the king, and the king's like, okay, well, I'm going to go with thousands of men. Like, that's not going to end well. I'm surprised Noland isn't putting any of this together. Like, doesn't he know this might escalate and this might lead to the death of the Shandians as this king and all of his men try and steal all the gold? But again, it doesn't come to that, because then Shandora gets shot way up into the sky. And again, I feel like this was the One Piece world's way of almost protecting their civilization and their people and their culture. As weird as that sounds, because I know they were immediately attacked by the Sky people, and it was horrible to watch. Like, it was one thing after Gunfall talked about it, it's another to see it, especially after you've gotten connected to the Shandians. But again, despite the fact that their land was stolen, which was horrible, I think the alternative would have been even worse had they stayed. Because even if they're able to fend off that king and all of his men, then what happens with all the other nations of the world that probably hear word of the City of Gold? They're probably sending men to go and attack. And again, it probably ends even worse. But I think the most sad and tragic part is Calgara's greatest regret is that he was never able to let his friend know where he was, that he was alive or anything like that. Because again, Noland doesn't know what happened to them. He doesn't know what happened to the Shandians. For all he knows, they're all dead. He thought maybe their city sunk into the sea. And the more this backstory went on, the more tragic and depressing it actually became. And it did not end well. Now, on the one hand, it is a truly impactful and great backstory, in my opinion, because I was genuinely left depressed by the end of this backstory, which is all kind of funny because when you think about it, it's all just a fictional story, but it is so well written. It doesn't stop you from actually relating to the people. It doesn't stop you from feeling like this is a real story with real living characters, which I think is a credit to One Piece. But again, it's bad enough that Calgara's homeland was taken from him. But what's even worse is in that moment, when you talk about his greatest regret, it wasn't even so much that he couldn't take back his homeland. Sure, that was a regret and he definitely wanted to do it. But his greatest regret was that he wasn't able to let his friend Noland know where he was. He wasn't able to tell his friend Noland, we're here, we still exist. The fire of Shandora has not gone out. And just knowing that connection that formed, just the closest of friendships between those two, is all the more tragic because we saw how close they were. And we saw how tragic it also ended for them, because the Calgara part was horrible, but just as bad, if not even slightly worse. I don't know. I don't even necessarily want to argue about who had it worse, because they're both incredibly bad endings to their stories. Now, deeply impactful, so I'm not saying bad as in the quality of the ending is bad, but as far as just how emotional they are, just tragic endings. But down at the Blue Sea, you have Noland, who's being publicly executed, and clearly you can look at his execution and see the parallels between Noland's one and the King of the Pirates. But again, one of those was almost a celebration of his life and his accomplishments, because sure, they're both being executed, but they have totally different feelings. One almost feels like a happy ending. The other feels like one of the most tragic endings, because Noland is only being called a liar. Here you have all these people out there who maybe some of them believed his story. Sure, they were kind of crazy, but like, what if they're true? What if I can go on adventures? What if I could find great treasures? I'm sure you had so many people that he inspired, and then their dreams are probably just crushed in a moment. But when you see the contrast between that and the King of the Pirates execution, where he probably lit a whole bunch of people's dreams, because he talked about this great treasure that's out there. And the thing is, nobody even knows if he's telling the truth about it or not. For all they know, Gold Roger was lying about this treasure and he was a true liar. Whereas Noland is heralded as a liar, but yet he never lied. In fact, he was so steadfast in his belief that the City of Gold existed, that Shandora was real, despite the fact that he knew how crazy it was that just this entire city was gone. But again, to the very end, he wouldn't deny the existence of his friends. He wouldn't deny the existence of Shandora. And there is something quite beautiful about that, a romanticism, so to speak, which is another theme that they keep hammering home. But with the King of the Pirates aspect of it, I did wonder for a moment, like, what if he was lying? And you see the contrasting executions. One guy was thought a liar, but he told the truth. And maybe the other guy told a lie, but everyone thought he was telling the truth. Now, I don't think that. I'm just saying I did entertain that thought for a bit. But I do think that there's a huge connection between both of these events. And I'm not simply talking about the look of the execution, but rather I'm talking about their treasures and just their lasting impact. And more specifically, that connection to Luffy, because by the end of the arc, you're able to see what Luffy is able to do as far as rectifying the Noland part of it by proclaiming the existence of this legendary city of gold. By lighting the fire of Shandora, he proclaimed Noland didn't lie and that the city of gold was real, and I can't wait to talk about that. And I think he's going to do much the same with the One Piece, because as we learned from Bellamy in the JAYA arc, there are plenty of people that doubt the existence of the One Piece, which makes sense because no one's been able to find it. Maybe it is just a wild goose chase that the King of the Pirates sent everyone on, because he just wanted to have one last laugh or something like that. But I don't believe that, because I think much like the legendary City of Gold, Luffy will prove the legendary One Piece was real, and he will also prove that Roger didn't lie. But even to get back to the very end of the backstory, as you see everyone calling Noland a liar, I remember him just tearing up, and that part kind of broke me, and especially when I think about it, the sadder and sadder it becomes. But I don't even think it was because everyone was calling him a liar. That's not the way I interpret it. I think it was more because when they call him a liar, it's because they're denying the existence of Shandora, the City of Gold, the existence of his friends. And again, Shandora fought so hard and for so long to prove that they existed. And worse than even that, he doesn't even know what happened to his friends. He thought that their city maybe sunk into the sea, but he doesn't know what happened to the Shandians. He doesn't know what happened to Calgara. For all he knows, they all died. And just the fact that he died not knowing that makes this moment all the more tragic, because I just know in that moment, right before he was about to die, if Calgara was able to get to the bell, if Calgara was able to ring that bell one last time, Noland would have heard it and he would have died, at least happy knowing his friends were fine. So just seeing how unresolved both of their lives ended, and how it kicked off 400 years of horrible histories for both of their descendants. Obviously, in Calgara's case, you had the Shandians. They were outcast from their own homeland. They're trying to take it back. Meanwhile, with Noland's descendants, they were also outcast from their own homeland, and everyone mocked and ridiculed Noland's descendants, but they still believed Noland's words. And so I thought that was a truly great backstory, but I just love how much it built up the stakes of this final conflict. And I know if there is one criticism I have of Skypiea, is that it doesn't always have the highest stakes. And the fact that basically everyone survives, not a great thing. But the fact is, that backstory, that had stakes, and it does introduce some stakes to this final conflict, because again, it is so important as Luffy is racing for that bell. He's trying to get to Eneru. And sure, Luffy wants to defeat Eneru, but more than that, he just wants to defeat Eneru to get to that bell. Eneru is an obstacle to the bell. And another big part of the reason I love this backstory is we see that it was being told to a child Wiper. And again, Wiper's reaction is like, what if we ring the bell now? Will Noland be able to hear the bell? But I love this idea that it sets up where Wiper has inherited the will of Calgara. And I do love how what is about to happen does parallel how Noland was able to save the Shandians, how first Calgara needed to accept that maybe this outsider, this Noland guy here, maybe he can actually save my people. And I feel like that parallels what's about to happen, because Wiper is going to have to accept he can't defeat Eneru, he can't save his people on his own. He's going to need Luffy's help, and he's going to need to help him first. And so the stage has been set for the final conflict, and I truly believe that the way that this arc ends, even including the backstory, but especially the way this arc ends, really did wipe away a lot of the bad elements, in my opinion, of this arc. And maybe that's not fair, because yes, there were some problems with this arc, and I've talked about some of the pacing and some of the lack of stakes, or some of the stakes that were removed by their inability to really kill off characters, especially the fake out deaths. But yes, what's about to happen, I feel like it has so many payoffs, and I do feel like the conclusion of this arc had a lot more emotional weight than many parts of this arc. In fact, that's one of my criticisms of this arc, is that there were a lot of moments that didn't feel like they added that much to the story, or maybe lasted way too long. But everything that happens at the end feels like it adds so much to just the impact of this journey, the impact of this story, because it pays off so much that even happened at the beginning of this arc, or in JAYA, or even at other points in the story. And I'll talk more about some of the other stuff, particularly some of the clues and details that they were laying out, as it references what they find at the end of the arc, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But before I even do, I have to talk about this final fight. Because we see Luffy is trying to get to Eneru with all of his might, and I do like the detail that Eneru may not say it, but he is afraid of Luffy. He keeps stopping him from even getting close, because, and I joked about this in another video, but he is so afraid of that guy. He kind of realized what many villains hadn't before, which is the best way of defeating Luffy, is to not even fight him, is just to execute your plan far away from him. Like Crocodile tried to fight him so many times, he basically killed him a few times, but Luffy came back because he will keep getting up. Again, you may be stronger than Luffy, but I genuinely believe if you don't kill him, or sometimes even if you do kill him, I mean, I joke about the killing part, but sometimes even if you do kill him, he'll just get back up, because the guy never quits, and I just love that. But again, Luffy doesn't stop. He's still trying to get to Eneru. He can't though, so he is going to need some help. But before even talking about that, I will say I like that we get a brief flashback. It's more so from Zoro's standpoint, because below Luffy, you have a group of basically all three of the groups that are fighting Eneru. You've got some of the Skypieans, you've got some of the Shandians with Wiper and Isa, you've got obviously some of the Straw Hats. But we see this flashback to an earlier point in this arc, where Luffy is just genuinely excited about ringing this bell. Again, everyone in the crew is kind of excited about finding the gold for varying reasons, but Luffy in particular is thinking about the golden bell. And the reason he is because he's thinking of Cricket. And this just harps back to one of the things I love about Luffy, is he places so much value on dreams, and if he likes you, he'll do whatever he can to help you achieve your dream. And Cricket, down in the Blue Sea, Noland's descendant, he just has a dream of finding out, did Noland lie? He just wants to know the answer for sure, and Luffy will do whatever he can to make sure that bell gets rung. And I don't know how he knows this, but somehow he does know it. Just deep in his core, he knows if he rings that bell, the sound can reach anyone who needs to hear it. It doesn't matter how far away you are. Luffy is sure of that fact, which is why he's also fighting so hard to ring that bell. And so I love this idea that Luffy isn't the brightest of characters. I've talked about how he doesn't really have any common sense, when no one else was really thinking of the significance of the bell. Somehow Luffy was way ahead of everyone in the crew, and he knew that is the most important thing that I want to do up here. I need to ring that bell. I need to let Cricket know his ancestor didn't lie. And I love this moment where Zoro finishes recalling that flashback, and he perfectly knows his captain, and he tells everyone, yeah, Luffy's not coming back until he rings that golden bell. And Wiper is listening in, and he's kind of curious, like, wait, what? Like, why does Luffy care about that bell? And I love the moment Wiper finds out exactly why, but before getting to that, I wanted to comment on how I love this connection between Zoro and Luffy, because Zoro's been with Luffy the longest, so he kind of also knows him the best. But he says, yeah, Nami will try and bring him back, but he's not going to come. And so as you see Eneru destroying everything, he's even destroying the home of the Skypieans with a massive attack. You just have Luffy looking on, and it is one of my favorite moments of this entire arc, of the entire saga. Just one of those very tense moments where Luffy is looking out, and the way that they animated with his hair just waving in the wind, and he is dead serious. And sure, I love jokative Luffy, I love when he's having fun, but when he gets serious, those are some of my favorite moments because they really stick out. Because for a character that isn't always the most intelligent, you know, he is probably thinking the most clearly out of any character in the One Piece world in those moments where he gets super locked in. Such as when he was looking at Blackbeard earlier, and I was just wondering, like, okay, what is he thinking? And I try and analyze it. And as he's looking out, Nami is like, Luffy, we've got to go. Like, it's over. We just have to escape at this point. But again, Luffy isn't one to run from a fight. And Luffy tells her, no, I've got unfinished business. And she's still trying to convince him to leave. We gotta escape. Which you can understand her position. But he's like, no, there's a golden bell up there. Which definitely confuses Nami, but I love how ironic this is because she's like, gold? Like, Luffy, don't worry about gold. Like, we just have to get away with our lives. And she looks at his arm. Like, you have plenty of gold there. But again, she's not understanding what Luffy is thinking about. And he tells her, like, Nami, you saw it. The city of gold existed. Cricket's ancestor, he didn't lie. I need to ring that bell. I need to let him know that his ancestor didn't lie. I need to let him know that the city of gold was in the sky all along. And you could kind of tell, like, he's surprising Nami. And to be fair, he's kind of surprising me to an extent. But it also shouldn't be surprising because, again, Luffy has these highly intelligent moments. They're rare, but they do happen. Every so often, they do happen. And in those moments, you realize, okay, that's why he's the captain. That's why he's the man who will become king of the pirates. Because almost in a unique way, he can also see things the most clearly. He doesn't often rely on common sense. In fact, he rarely does. But he has this clear picture or clear worldview. Even when you look at his journey, like the fact is, so many people have told him his dream is crazy, it's stupid. Like you want to be king of the pirates? Don't you understand that that's impossible? But again, Luffy has such a perfect way of viewing the world in this crazy One Piece world. Because he's like, well, I won't know until I try. So what is there to be afraid of? And I just love how much sense he can make at points like this. But he goes on to say, like, I know it. If I ring that bell, Cricket will be able to hear it, and he's not wrong. But again, this moment just got me so fired up, like I would run through a brick wall for Luffy in that moment. Well, I wouldn't actually be able to run through it, but I'd run into a brick wall for Luffy. But I love this next moment where Nami decides, okay, I'm gonna help you, Luffy. And the reason I love this so much is because Nami, obviously, she's afraid, but she trusts her captain. And so Nami thinks of an idea to send a message to everyone down below to cut the beanstalk so it falls towards Eneru's ship, so her and Luffy can ride the waver up and get to him. And so she sends a message down, they understand it, they're trying to cut down the beanstalk, and what I love so much about it is Wiper is asking Robin, like, wait, I don't understand, and he's almost getting kind of upset. Like, why does this matter so much to that Straw Hat kid? Like, this is our business. It's we, the Shandians, who are the inheritors of Calgara's will and wishes. This doesn't matter to him. Like, why does he care? And I just love how Robin explains why it matters to Luffy. Like, she doesn't fully know, but she's speculating based on everything she's heard. Because Robin starts talking about how over 400 years ago, an adventurer lied about a city of gold. And despite the fact that he was called a liar and was ridiculed, for 400 years his descendants believed. And Robin tells Wiper how Luffy believes if he rings that bell, he'll be able to tell this one particular descendant that Noland didn't lie, that the city of gold was in the sky. And I love that as Wiper is listening to this and the realization set in, he is getting emotional because he's realizing, and he asks for the descendant's name and she tells him Mont Blanc Cricket. And he's starting to realize, like, oh my goodness, that's Noland's descendant. Wait, Noland's descendants have believed all this time? And he clarifies, like, wait, was his ancestor Noland? And she says yes. And just seeing this very stoic warrior and Wiper start to break down as he's realizing what has happened, and just the improbability of someone like Luffy coming up here and carrying that will with him. Someone like Luffy who actually has the ability to defeat Eneru and is trying to end Calgara's greatest regret of ringing that bell, of lighting the fire of Shandora, despite the fact that Luffy doesn't even know about Calgara, but he knows just enough to know the significance. And in that moment, Wiper realizes, like, okay, I can't defeat Eneru, but that Straw Hat kid, he can. He can light the fire of Shandora, and I need to help him. Much like how 400 years ago, Calgara first had to trust Noland and help him for Noland to save all of his people. Wiper has to put his trust in Luffy so Luffy can help save everyone. And I like how Wiper fully accepts his fate and he goes over to the beanstalk and he's thinking of how patient they've been. For 400 years they've believed. They believed that my homeland existed. And he uses the reject dial, probably thinking it's going to kill him. But at that moment he's going to do whatever he can to help Luffy get to Eneru, to help Luffy get a shot of lighting the fire of Shandora, of ringing that bell. And there's just something so romantic and beautiful about that, because the beanstalk does start to fall towards Eneru's ship, and Nami and Luffy are going up. And something else I forgot to mention is Nami told Luffy that she would give him a ride up with the waver, and he was a little confused, like, Nami, I thought you didn't want to help, or I thought you were too afraid to. And she just says, like, Luffy, I just need you to guarantee my life. And again, I love this because whether or not he can, he says he can, but whether or not he can, she trusts her captain enough in that moment that she's going to do whatever he says. So Luffy and Nami are heading up to the beanstalk towards Eneru and his ship. Meanwhile, you have Eneru winding up this massive storm. This is basically the final storm. It will destroy the rest of the land. But before he can bring it down, Luffy jumps straight into the storm. He's confronting the storm head on. And one of the details that I love the most is, sure, Luffy's rubber, but even in this storm, you don't know what's going to happen to him. What's he going to do in this storm? But one of the details I love is that the very golden ball that Eneru gave Luffy is also the very golden ball that's going to be used to bring him down for good. Because Luffy starts spinning that gold ball all around, destroys the storm, brings the dawn, and it is one of the most visually spectacular moments of the arc. But one of the funniest parts about it is Eneru realized, like, oh no, that gold ball that I gave him, it destroyed my storm. And he looks at Luffy and he's kind of pissed off at this point. Like, how dare you, you stupid monkey from the blue sea? Which again, I feel like that has so many callbacks to Sun Wukong in Chinese mythology, because Sun Wukong fought against the gods. What is this monkey from the blue sea doing? Fighting against God? But anyway, at this point, the fight is as good as over. It does go on for a little bit, but then Luffy winds up his final attack. He uses a golden rifle, and I love the way this is animated, because you can just feel the power behind it with the sound design and just how quick it is, and it's too quick for Eneru, So that gold ball is coming at him way too fast, totally destroys him, but it keeps going because it's almost quite fitting that Luffy's true target wasn't even Eneru. Like, Eneru was in the way, but his true target is behind him, and it's that golden bell, because Luffy is going to light the fire of Shandora and proclaim to Cricket and everyone who needs to hear, the City of Gold exists and it's in the sky. And I just love this moment. It is one of the best moments I've seen in One Piece. Just a perfect conclusion to a fight, as Luffy simultaneously breaks the gold ball, totally defeats Eneru, and rings the golden bell just all at once. Perfect. Such a great conclusion to 400 years of a horrible conflict and horrible history. And just thinking of how depressing that Noland and Calgara backstory was makes this moment all the more worthwhile. And I love what Luffy says in that moment as the bell is ringing for the first time in hundreds of years. Old guy, can you hear it? For 400 years, the City of Gold has been here all this time. In the sky. It is just so fitting that he was thinking of Cricket in that moment. If you're a friend of Luffy's, he will go to whatever ends to help you out. We've seen it over and over again as Luffy has gone through his journey. He'll do whatever it takes to help out his friends and people achieve their dreams if he believes in them. And as the bell is ringing, I just love the reactions we get from everyone because it is just such a beautiful sound. And you can tell that the fighting is over. You just feel like the conflict is gone from this land. And the reaction I love most of all is Cricket's down in the blue sea, because again, he and all of his monkey friends, they're all hearing the bell. And I love that they know immediately what it means and they know the significance of it. Because Cricket even says, yeah, there's no doubt about it. Only one bell echoes this far. This is romanticism, which again is such a huge theme of this series. Heck, the series began with Romance Dawn. So why shouldn't Luffy's entire journey and his adventure be a romantic one? But a nice payoff that I really love, which I had forgotten about when I was first watching this, but it is a great payoff in the moment, is Cricket is talking about those giant shadows that sometimes appear. And he's talking about a theory that people used to believe that there were people in the sky and that what we were seeing was just their shadows, but nobody had any proof of that until now. And you just see it is Luffy's shadow in the sky as he's celebrating. It is just so perfect, and it just sums up Luffy in such an incredible way. And so in that moment they know the City of Gold was in the sky, the Sky Islands exist, and Noland wasn't a liar. Just hearing Cricket say for the first time, truly knowing it, Noland, my ancestor, he wasn't a liar. And so Luffy helped Cricket solve this conflict he had been fighting his entire life. And I love how Cricket is going on and he's thanking Luffy because he knows what Luffy has done for him. He knows that Luffy rang that bell to let him know the City of Gold was in the sky. Also to make sure that he wouldn't keep searching and killing himself by diving deep into the ocean looking for it. But arguably the best part, or maybe the part that I like the most, is Cricket starts crying his eyes out. But I love the reason he's crying because he's like, I'm just glad that they're okay. I was so worried. Which I had totally forgotten. Like sometimes it's easy to forget that a lot of the characters in this world don't just expect like our crew will have plot armor and if they fire themselves into the sky, that it's going to work out for them. But it's easy to assume, yeah, they fired themselves into the sky. There's a good chance that they die from that. But yes, I love the way that this arc, especially at the end, resolved the Cricket conflict. And this also got me really excited, anticipating when Luffy actually finds the One Piece, because it will probably be like that times 100 or something like that. Like he will prove to everyone Roger didn't lie. Not that people looked at Roger the same way that they looked at Nolan the liar, but he will be able to prove that the One Piece is real. And I love the way this arc especially closes out, even when I'm thinking of this one moment I'm going to talk about quickly with Robin and the Poneglyphs and what that means. But when we go back, we just see like the aftermath of everything that happens. And one of the things I don't like is you're seeing all of the Shandians get up. A lot of them had been shocked by Eneru. And again, they're getting up, which means he didn't kill anyone. So that was just kind of the confirmation. But if that wasn't bad enough, then you see Conus's father just appear. And again, I 100% thought this guy had died. Like, Some of the other Shandians, I thought, okay, maybe they survived. This was the one death I thought was actually for real. But not just even that, but then Gunfall's former men, when he was God, it's revealed they're all alive, which I thought it was kind of implied that they attacked Eneru once they found out his plan, and he killed them all. I thought that was implied, but apparently not. So again, I'm not a fan of the fake out deaths because that does kind of remove some of the impact. And then something else that caught me a little off guard is you see Eneru fall into the sea, and part of me had the assumption like, okay, he's a little too dangerous, and he's not like a villain you can just send to prison like Crocodile, because how are you going to get him to prison? You would need sea prism stone and all sorts of stuff, and you would need the Marines up here, but they're not up here. So I just kind of assumed like maybe that's their way of taking care of him, like the ocean will just swallow him up. But then you see him flying away, he's flying towards the moon. So that was what his endless birth was. Now, since then I've kind of learned that there's this whole cover story of his adventures on the moon in the manga. So I will definitely go and check that out. But at the same time, I don't know how much of a fan I am of even Eneru surviving. Not that I thought Luffy killed him, but he also seemed a little too dangerous. And to an extent where this is different from a lot of the other villains Luffy defeats, is he often crushes their dreams, and you know, their dreams are often horrible dreams where they hurt a lot of people. But it doesn't feel like Luffy truly crushed his dreams. He only crushed part of his dream. The part of his dream being, I'm going to destroy all of Skypiea. But he's just sailing away, living out the rest of his dream, which was to go to Endless Verth, the moon. So it kind of feels like, what did he really lose? He got a bad beating. I guess that was it. So again, I wasn't necessarily a fan of the way that resolved, but who knows, maybe I'll feel different after I see that cover story. And also if he returns for another big event in a future point of the story, it would make a little bit more sense. But again, it was just one of those things where this guy was destroying all of Skypiea moments ago, and he's sailing away. He could easily destroy all of Skypiea if he wanted to. Like, who would be able to stop him at this point? So I'm not really a fan of that, but it doesn't ruin my experience of the arc or anything like that, because part of me just has to trust that there's a reason that he's able to just go to the moon. And one of the cool details is it does introduce space travel to One Piece, which makes the world feel a little different. It definitely opens up some unique possibilities, not to mention I hope he doesn't like do some crazy stuff on the moon, because the moon is very important. If it's anything close to like our real world moon, which I have a feeling it might be, because you know the moon controls the tides and stuff like that, which for a planet that's mostly ocean, that could be a problem if this guy starts messing up some stuff on the moon. But I will look at that cover story because I am interested. But eventually we get a grand celebration around this bonfire where all the groups are just dancing. And I know it's stupid, but I felt so much pride for Luffy in that moment. Like, look at what you did, Luffy. Isn't this great? Luffy, and by extension, the other members of the crew and everyone who helped out, because I guess it was a team effort. But again, look at what Luffy and his crew are able to accomplish. They came to the Sky Island, not really knowing what they were in for, and yet they resolved an over 400-year-long conflict, and somehow they even helped make friends between the Shandians and the Skypieans. Like, they did a lot. And the craziest part is they did it in like 2 days. Now what happens next is one of the most interesting things I've seen, not just in this arc, not just in this saga, but in all of One Piece, because it got me speculating. I even made a whole video on it, so I won't go into as much detail as I did there, but at the same time, they pull out the golden bell, and it reveals that it has a massive poneglyph in it, which of course makes sense, judging by the flashbacks. And all of a sudden Robin comes up, and she makes it pretty clear that she can read it. And I'll be honest, I didn't think too much of the poneglyph that was part of the Alabasta arc, but after another poneglyph appeared in a massive arc, all of a sudden I started to think through, like, okay, maybe these things are a lot more important than I was thinking, if they appear in back-to-back major arcs. But I feel like all of that was confirmed by what's about to happen, because Robin is reading it, but this poneglyph, much like the Alabasta one, points to an ancient weapon, and from what Crocodile wanted it for and what he said it could do, or at least what he said Pluton could do, this one is a little different. This is Poseidon, but they're both ancient weapons, so I'm going to assume that they both have comparable destructive abilities. But it is interesting that Robin isn't happy about this news at all. In fact, she's actually saddened by it because her mission isn't to find these ancient weapons. She has no use of these ancient weapons, at least not that she knows of. But her mission is to learn the lost history of the world. So when she finds back-to-back poneglyphs that only point to ancient weapons, she legitimately thought at that moment, oh, my dream is stupid, my dream is over. Like, these poneglyphs just lead to ancient weapons. They don't have history on them, which Crocodile and a lot of people would be very interested in what those poneglyphs have to say. But again, that doesn't interest Robin because history and lost knowledge is way more important to her than any sort of ancient weapon. Now, to be fair, ancient weapons are kind of lost knowledge, or at least their whereabouts. But she's walking away thinking that maybe her dream is over, maybe it's dumb. And then someone points out this little writing on the side of the belfry, on the side of the bell. And she looks, and who else but Goldie Roger left it. And that's when it all started to click. Because again, even I wasn't really thinking like too much about these poneglyphs. I thought that they were important before I saw this. But the moment I saw Goldie Roger's name attached, not to mention what he actually says, but the moment I saw his name, I was like, okay, this is important all of a sudden. But one of the things I've learned about One Piece is, sure, any detail can mean so much and it can hint at so much. That's not to say every detail does, because even in this arc, there were probably a ton of useless details. But when the King of the Pirates' name comes up, you better pay close attention. And I started paying extremely close attention. I was even racking my brain. I was making all sorts of theories. I was probably losing it to a certain extent. And the thing is, I know that not all my theories are right. If even some of them are, I'm fairly happy with that. Like, even if I get 10% of them right, I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest. Because it means, well, I'm 10% right, and I only hear the right part. But Roger's words say, I made it here, and I will guide this text to the ends of the earth. And Robin starts thinking this through, and she realizes what that means. That Roger carried this information to the final island, to Raftel. And if I didn't start to think that the poneglyphs were important enough before I heard he carried this information to the final island, I definitely started to now, and I was racking my brain. First off, though, I was truly impressed in this moment with Roger, because he came up to the Sky Island, and not only did he come up here, but apparently he thought that this poneglyph was so important that he went even way above Skypiea into the clouds to find this golden bell and actually read the information and then leave a message. So these poneglyphs were so important to Roger, and all of a sudden I started connecting them to the One Piece. And my theory, which again, I don't necessarily want to know like what I get right or wrong and stuff like that, and please no spoilers. My theory at this point is that if you learn all the information on all the poneglyphs and you put it together, now it forms a Rio poneglyph, which is Robin's primary wish, because she believes that the Rio poneglyph will form the lost history of the world. She'll know what happened in the Void Century, which is all incredibly important, and I'm definitely looking forward to learning what happened. But at the same time, I believe that if you put all of it together, it will have the destination of the final island, or to a certain extent, major hints within the poneglyphs to the final island, because I genuinely believe that there's a good reason no one's been able to find the final island to find the One Piece. And it seems to be like there's all these clues all over the world, and the poneglyphs would be a great way of hiding clues, because even if you can find them, even if you can find all of them, you have to be able to read this language, and apparently Roger could. So that's also kind of crazy. And it made me go back to Roger's execution when he was talking about where his treasure was. He says, you'll have to search the whole world, and he stresses whole world. And that's when I realized, if you're not willing to go everywhere and anywhere, then you don't have a shot of finding the One Piece. Because, again, Luffy is someone who is willing to go, but so many people would never think to go up into the sky or go to these crazy places. In fact, if their log post pointed to somewhere that seems impossible, they would assume the log post is broken, is something I've learned. But again, Luffy is not that kind of person. And I feel like this right here is such a huge payoff for Luffy basically deciding, yeah, I'm going to risk my life to go on a crazy adventure into the sky. I'm going to trust the log pose. I'm not going to care what other people think. They're going to mock me for believing in a sky island. But this right here, this little tidbit, if I'm somewhat right, and that the Poneglyphs do hold some sort of clues to the One Piece to the final island, then this part of the arc made the entire arc a much more rewarding experience. And even if I'm wrong and the Poneglyphs don't quite point to the One Piece, then, well, these Poneglyphs are still really important and you have to read them because you still have to put their information together to form the real Poneglyph and learn the lost history of the world. So that's also fundamentally important. But again, I do think that they are tied to the final island and the One Piece, because why would Roger bring that information there? And even on another level, I love the fact that Robin was even rewarded for joining Luffy's crew, because this is a place she probably would have never come. Not to mention, even if she did come here, there's no guarantee that she would ever find the Golden Bell way up in the sky. Like, how are you even going to be able to find it? And something else I love about this moment is that as Robin is walking away, all of a sudden you have Gunfall and he's talking about, like, yeah, he remembers when this Roger guy came up here. And he tells Robin that Luffy reminds him of Roger, which again, I've heard that before. It is always nice to hear it because it just reaffirms what so many of us know, that Luffy is special. But even when I think of it in the context of this, Roger is the only pirate that Gunfall remembers, and Gunfall was God here. So if you were ever to get close to this Golden Bell and this Poneglyph, Gunfall probably would have saw you, and he doesn't recall other pirates. At least he doesn't make any mention of other pirates. That's not to say that they didn't come up here, but even if other pirates came up here, who's to say that they found the Golden Bell? So I do think it's fair to assume that Luffy and his crew are the first group of pirates to find that Poneglyph since Roger and his pirates, and if it was important to them, it's bound to be important to Luffy and his crew. So again, I feel like this was such a massive payoff, and it makes Skypiea so much more important if this is even somewhat true. Even if a fraction of what I think is true, Skypiea all of a sudden became way more important in this conclusion. And even if this part of it wasn't in the conclusion, I still think Skypiea overall would be a pretty good arc. Sure, some weak points, but because this was in the conclusion, it just elevates the way I think of it. So yeah, a lot of my rating is heavily skewed to how highly I rate the final conclusion, and endings are incredibly important to stories. And as I said at the start of this video, one thing that this entire saga kind of reaffirmed, or really just made me realize even more, was how detail-oriented and just how great the world building of this One Piece world actually was. I just love how many little details have so much meaning. And another reason this moment is so great is that Robin is able to translate Roger's words and learn that he carried all this information to the final island, and that the job of the Shandians is complete. They don't have to protect this stone anymore because the information got where it needed to go, which makes me wonder, why did the information need to go to Raftel in the first place? And I've even heard that Raftel is referred to other names. I'm just going off of what the subbed version of the anime goes by. It just opens up so many questions and it gets me so excited for the future. Like, okay, where is this series going to go? Because at this moment, more so than really any other point in the story, I felt like the potential of this story could go in more directions than I ever thought, which is a big part of the reason I do like this arc in totality, because it genuinely did a great job at the end, or at least it did with me. It did a great job of building up anticipation to go to future arcs, to go to future places, so I can't wait. But it was nice how Robin went from the lowest of lows in the Alabasta arc, from wanting to die because she thought she would never be able to learn the lost history, the full history of the world. If she hadn't even made any progress through all of this time, what was even the point? But Luffy saved her against her wishes. But the fact that she joined his crew, and within a few days, because it's really only been a few days as far as I know, within a few days, she's gone on an impossible adventure to a place that only existed in fantasy and learned stuff very few people in the world have probably ever known. So that is just crazy, and she's reaffirmed that yes, Roger carried this information to the final island. That's what I'm going to do now. And she's so excited to put together the Rio Poneglyph. And it was at that moment I realized Robin is one of the most important people, not just for sentimental value, but just one of the most important people in the world of One Piece as far as actual value, because what's more valuable than lost information? Not to mention, I think she can really help Luffy find the One Piece. Like, she is essential, at least if I'm somewhat right. Now, the conclusion of this arc is just hilarious, but it also ends in kind of a nice way, because Robin is offered a massive piece of this golden belfry that broke off. Like, this thing is massive. I don't even think that they could fit it on the ship, to be honest. So she's very happy, and they start transporting it. But in the meantime, while Robin was figuring out all this information, Luffy and the rest of the Straw Hats were stealing the gold from the inside of the snake, which is also funny to think about because they're trying to steal gold. Meanwhile, the Shandians and the Skypieans want to offer them even more gold. So it's just one of those funny things. And a little detail I also wanted to make note of is I do like the fact that Usopp traded with a lot of the Skypieans and the Shandians for their dials. So it is cool that they're bringing a lot of the dials down to the Blue Sea. Those will probably have some great future implications, so I can't wait to see exactly what Usopp and the crew does with them. But this next moment is hilarious because the Straw Hats have all their gold. They're thinking they're robbing everyone up here blind, basically, and they are about to make a run for it, but they're waiting for Robin, and they see Robin and a whole bunch of people carrying this giant gold pillar, and the misunderstandings that happen here. Again, this is a stupid scene. This isn't like I'm analyzing it necessarily. It's just funny because the Straw Hats are like, we gotta run. We're trying to steal this gold. They're trying to offer them way more gold than they could have ever possibly stolen. But even Usopp starts to think that that's a cannon, and the misunderstandings are hilarious, especially when Robin realizes what's happening, like, because she knows Luffy and the Straw Hats are, you know, they're the Straw Hats, and she's putting it together and she just finds it funny, and she's like, yeah, they're kind of crazy, but they're my group of crazies. She tells them they don't need that giant gold that they were trying to offer them, and they all just run to the ship and they say goodbye to Conus and her father. And I love that as they're sailing away, everyone is saying goodbye to them, ringing the bell. They'll never forget them. And something else I wanted to make note of is the Shandian girl Isa. She had this great moment after the fighting. She's talking about Luffy, and you could tell that Luffy inspired her, and she's doing like gum gum pistol because she thinks Luffy is like the coolest person in the world. And obviously, I love the connection it had between Luffy and Shanks. Without Shanks inspiring Luffy, we don't have all these adventures. So who's to say what someone like Isa will be able to do in the future, or other people along the way that Luffy and his crew inspires. So I just love that detail, because at the end, I love how through living out their dreams, they're also inspiring other people to make dreams of their own. But the Straw Hats are leaving for good. And sure, like, by the end, the adventure was kind of nice up here, but I was happy to be returning to the Blue Sea. It was almost a little refreshing, like, okay, finally going back. Almost home, but, you know, it's obviously not my home, but that was almost the feeling I got. And just the drop-off was kind of wild. I mean, I guess I should have expected no less from One Piece, but with the octopus, and they obviously fall into G8. I know it's a filler arc, I'm going through it now, but so far it's pretty fun. I just thought great conclusion overall. And again, just to give a final summary of my thoughts, not a perfect arc. It does have problems with pacing and some of the stakes, for example, but I also feel from the way it closes strong and a lot of the great moments along the way that overall it was an enjoyable arc. Definitely a must watch, especially because of the implications I feel of what happens at the end. But even if I'm kind of wrong about some of those theories, just the Noland and Calgara backstory, the Luffy and Eneru final fight, just the very conclusion, great. I feel like every One Piece fan should watch it, or just, you know, every anime fan. I love the way One Piece was able to introduce us to an entirely new culture up in the sky, with some incredible world building with their technologies, even some of their history and their conflicts, and exactly what is kind of going on up here. And one of the nice things is that the Skypieans and the Shandians are finally getting along. They've finally come to some sort of peace agreement. And overall, I would say that the villain Eneru was a pretty good villain. I wouldn't say great. He wasn't on the level of Crocodile or some of the other top tier villains in my opinion. but he was also good. Again, I feel like he was largely undercut by the fact that everyone was surviving his stuff, and in many ways I still want to see his story fleshed out a little bit more, so hopefully I see more of him. But anyway, those are my thoughts on this long saga. What do you think? If you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.